Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. My name is Eric Trexler. I am the special temporary primary host of the show, and today I'm joined by Greg Nuckols. He is currently the permanent guest co-host for the time being. Greg, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
How are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you?
I am doing well because I unlocked a new experience in life.
Do tell.
I was in San Jose, California. I was on a podcast, which, by the way, we really need to upgrade our podcast situation. I know you were on Dave Tate's podcast. I was a guest on Mind Pump. I walk in. There's a team of people diligently working around the clock to make that operation work. The studio is all like soundproofed with all these different cameras and microphones. There was a producer there rather than the on-air talent producing it as we go. They got a real operation going on. It leaves a lot to be desired when I come back home.
Well, as the person who heads up the podcast, I would say that ball is firmly in your court.
Yeah, I saw a bunch of Twitter threads about CGI companies who are really upset with their working conditions. I think we should just lean into it and do like a half CGI situation and really boost the quality.
I think that would be fun.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
Like really make it a multimedia production. But anyway, not the point of the story. I was in San Jose and I experienced my first like substantial earthquake. Like I think when I was younger, at some point in my life, I heard that an earthquake occurred. I don't remember if it was in Ohio or North Carolina. But, you know, it was like, hey, an earthquake happened, but you probably didn't feel it. And I was like, yeah, I didn't feel it.
Yeah.
So I was sitting there in San Jose and I mean, like stuff on the walls was like shaking and moving. And I was like, whoa, this is for real. So there's a magnitude 5.1 earthquake that happened about 12 miles away was the epicenter. So like, you know, a 5.1 isn't like a crazy magnitude, but I was looking up stuff and apparently values above 5 are pretty rare, even in the Bay Area in California. Obviously, California is known for having a lot of earthquakes just because of the tectonic plates over there. But apparently in the last 30 years in the Bay Area, they've only had like 3 or 4 earthquakes that are of that magnitude. So even for the locals, it was a bit of an atypical experience. And apparently, just for frame of reference, I like to kind of put it into units that people kind of know better than just like a Richter scale. So about 20 million kilograms of dynamite. If you've ever felt that type of energy release, that's about what we were talking about in terms of the seismic activity.
Yeah, so I don't know what 20 million kilograms of dynamite sounds like or feels like, but I do have some secondhand experience with dynamite. Not going to share.
Yeah, don't admit to any crimes.
I'm not going to share too many details here because I don't want to accidentally get anyone in trouble. But someone I know used to be able to legally get their hands on dynamite, and they had a large tree on their property that they wanted taken down, and like we're talking about like a huge tree, absolutely enormous, the type of deal that is certainly not amenable to just like a chainsaw.
Yeah.
So it would be the type of deal where, you know, you need to get some forestry folks out. It would have been quite expensive, would have been a whole rigmarole. And, you know, he wasn't taking it down just for fun. Like the tree was starting to like decay, die, whatever. Like it needed to come down. And so he looked at his options and determined that it would be far cheaper and more efficient to simply drill a hole in the tree, stick some dynamite in and blow it up. So that's what he did. And I was like kind of a long way away, like, you know, not like 100 yards. We're talking on the scale of like, maybe like a mile away, give or take, when it happened. Didn't know it was going to happen. And like, I mean, it was loud enough that it was still quite scary.
Yeah.
And apparently if you were within like 100, 200 yards, there was a notable shock wave, like a lot of energy release. And I mean, my first thought is growing up in kind of redneck country, I thought someone had gotten their hands on like one of those like barely legal firearms that's like basically small artillery. Like it was pretty serious. But yeah, I think that was just like a stick or two. So I imagine 20 million kilograms would be really something.
Yeah. So it was my first earthquake experience. That was on the bucket list, so I can check that off. The earthquake itself, I wasn't really worried. But like, so the earthquake starts happening. I'm like, oh wow, it's really happening. And I'm, kind of just observing. And then I remembered that tsunamis exist, and I was like, where's the epicenter for this? But yeah, so fortunately, despite the high magnitude, it doesn't look like there was a ton of like damage or injuries or anything like that.
That's good.
But it got me thinking about natural disasters. And there was one thing in my past that I kind of go back to, and it happened when I was a kid. So I guess I was like 8-ish years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I remembered as a kid, there was like a big tornado in my town. And I was like, I wonder if I can find any information about that, just to like understand the scale of what happened. Because when you're a kid, you blow everything out of proportion. Your hometown is the whole world in your eyes. So I was like, I wondered like if there's a way to kind of contextualize how big that was. So I Google it thinking maybe I'll find like a local newspaper story that's like archived on the internet. There was a Wikipedia page for the tornado that hit my homtown when I was like 8. So like, if anything, I found out that I was underselling it in my childlike mind.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I looked it up, and when I was a kid, there was like a storm system that came through that spit out like 54 confirmed tornadoes, and I think 3 of them were F4 on the tornado scale, which I believe goes up to F5. But yeah, I mean, there were like hundreds and hundreds of buildings just destroyed. I think the damage estimate here is 82 million, for a little, like, not little, but with tornadoes, you don't necessarily anticipate such widespread damage with that time. A lot of times, like, if you live in an area that doesn't have a lot of tornadoes, a normal tornado situation, at least in my experience growing up in Ohio, is the storm conditions are right for a tornado to occur. And so everyone says, hey, look out, there might be a tornado. What do you do with that information? Frankly, not much.
Yeah.
Because it's just like a wall of clouds, and it's like one might pop up somewhere, we don't know. Maybe it'll touch the ground, who knows? And it'll last for like a little bit of time and then just disappear.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so normally, it'll just kind of drop down, you'll see the funnel cloud, something will happen, and it'll take out like a few houses on a street or something, or like, really significantly damaged, just a small little area, broadly speaking. But every now and then you get these systems that kick out a ton of tornadoes, and some of them are huge, and they'll really, really cut through a town. So, looking back at it, I kind of didn't understand the scope of the natural disaster. 1, because I was a child, and 2, because I slept through the entire thing.
Nice.
I just woke up, and my parents were like, yeah, you don't have school. And I was like, why? And they're like, look around. Like, take a hint, man. Like there's like 200 buildings damaged here. But so Greg, natural disasters, what do you got for us? Have you been through any?
Yeah, the biggest one, it was also an instance of sleeping through something. My wife and I were on an anniversary trip when Hurricane Matthew was coming through a few years back, and we could have rescheduled it, but we had already had to reschedule it because when we were trying to go for our actual anniversary, got in an accident, totaled the car, ended up not taking the anniversary trip then, so we had to reschedule it. We ended up rescheduling it during hurricane season, thinking like, North Carolina generally gets hit by about 1 hurricane per year, so what are the odds it'll be that weekend? Anyway, turned out to be that weekend, but we said, you know what, we have a summer anniversary, already rescheduling for like October. It's not really an anniversary trip if we reschedule for like February, and also it was kind of the furthest extent of like the beach actually being like a beach vacation. You know, like once you start getting into November and it's cold, it's a whole different vibe. So we said, whatever, like we're still going to do it. And it looked like at the time the forecasts were saying that Matthew was going to arc back out into the ocean, but it ended up just going right over us. Like the eye of the storm passed over us. Thankfully, it wasn't that big of a deal. I believe Matthew peaked as a Category 5 hurricane, but I believe it was like a weak Category 1 when it went over us.
Wow.
But yeah, I slept through the whole thing. We were in the kind of like back half of the storm wall when I woke up the next morning, and the wind was so loud, it sounded like someone was running like a lawnmower right outside our window. I was like, what is going on? It's ridiculous. We look outside and it's just, like it was kind of the outside part of the storm wall. So I think it was like 50, 60 mile an hour winds. And there wasn't really any danger, but certainly if there had been, it was past by that point. So it actually ended up being a very cool and fun experience, because for the first maybe like 2 hours of that morning, when we were still like in the last little remnants of the storm wall, like it was just like pretty consistent 50 to 70 mile an hour wind, which is, I mean, it's whipping, but like it's not going to take you off your feet. So we just went outside and hopped in a hot tub, and it felt like just chilling through the apocalypse. Like you look around, the sky looks insane. We could see the ocean. Some of the most ludicrous waves. We could see sometimes when the wind shifted direction, the water would like blow out and the waves would break into the ocean instead of into the shore, which that was a crazy sight to see.
Yeah.
And yeah, we're just sitting in the hot tub, just kind of observing everything. And that was fun. It was, I would say, like 2% scary and 98% just generally interesting. Then for something that was quite a bit scarier, I would say, is I went to college in Arkansas, which is also Tornado Alley. And we had, every year we were there, we had multiple tornado warnings. I think only one tornado ever actually touched down on campus, but it just kind of like just plopped down on the quad for a second, destroyed one of the oldest and most beautiful trees you'll ever see, and then just left. Like it was as if it had a grudge against that particular tree. Yeah. And then just moved on with life.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at, though, is like when that happens, there's like they'll put out a warning for like 7 counties and say like, hey, this might happen. Where? We don't know. Yes. And it just drops down and does it.
But as kind of like a second-hand thing related to that. So there were tornadoes all the time in that area. And my first semester there, so for people listening who don't know, I went to a Christian school. And so we had chapel every day, which, as not a morning person, wasn't really my preference, but it was what it was. And during my first semester there, there had been a hurricane that had torn through a community, pretty close, like just a little bit down the road. And it had completely destroyed the elementary school. And so one of the first chapels of that semester, they were kind of taking up a collection, like raising money to help them rebuild the elementary school. Like very, very nice, good thing to do. So raised money, they rebuilt the school. Couple years later, guess what? Another band of tornadoes came through, destroyed the school again. This was like junior year, I believe. And so once again, we have a chapel, and I'm pretty sure no one was, like, I don't think, like, kids were killed in the school. These were tornadoes that came through at night, destroyed the school when people weren't in it, as far as I remember. But yeah, so another chapel, raised some more money to help rebuild the school. All good. They rebuild the school. And then I want to say...
Well, that's good, though, because, I mean, if a tornado hit a school twice, it's not going to get hit a third. Like, there's no chance that it would get hit a third time.
Well, I think you see where this is going. 2 years after I graduated, thereabouts, I was still on the Harding mailing list, and we got an email saying, what do you know? More tornadoes came through. And would you believe it? They destroyed that same elementary school again. So, same general process. And on one hand, that's obviously sad. Like it's disrupting those kids' learning. Also, it's obviously very nice that every time this happens, community pulls together, raises money. It's also nice that Harding was willing to chip in, because like Harding itself is a quite well endowed school. And a lot of the surrounding area is very poor, like very constrained, like local budgets and whatnot. So it's nice that they were willing to help out. But there is just like a bit of dark humor and irony there, where it's like, it's God's will that we should try to collect money to help rebuild this school, but maybe it's actually God's will that there not be an elementary school in that exact spot. Right. Who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was kind of a secondhand natural disaster type experience.
Yeah, and I should clarify, since people actually listen to this, if you are in a place that gets a tornado warning and you don't know how tornadoes work, you should ideally get to like a basement or a cellar. You want to be underground, and if you can't be underground, you want to be on the lowest floor possible and get to a building with really firm walls inside the structure. So usually like people will go to a bathroom that's centrally located in their home because the walls have plumbing running through them that kind of reinforces it. So I don't want to be the person who convinces people to take no action when they get a tornado warning.
And that's good information for us to have as well. You informed me of this recently. Apparently, Tornado Alley is moving east.
It is.
So we thought we were getting out of it, but 20, 30 years from now, we might be able to put our prior tornado experience to good use.
We might. Hopefully not, but we might. Okay, so we have to sell out really quick here. That's really the purpose here. We just want to show these various products and opportunities. So if you like the show, you can support it many different ways. Number one, you could like, rate, or subscribe wherever you access the show. If you like free weekly newsletters with research updates, everybody likes that. Get on the email newsletter. Sign up for our email list. It goes out every week. Nice, fresh update with new training and nutrition-related research updates. You can do that at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter. If you're looking for one-on-one online coaching, you can find that at strongerbyscience.com/coaching. If you want a discount on your supplements, you can get them at bulksupplements.com using the discount code SBSPOD for a 5% discount. If you like the kind of content we do, you can get more of it every single month in the Mass Research Review. We publish that the first of the month, every month, along with Dr. Mike Zordos and Dr. Eric Helms. And if you're looking for a food logger or nutrition app that does have built-in coaching functionality to kind of help you decide what your macro target should be, check out Macro Factor. We co-developed it, and you can do a free trial so you can take it for a spin and see if you like it before you make a financial commitment. And we do have two great segments today, but first we need to fully complete the process of selling out. We're going to take a quick timeout for an obscene profit break. As the first and only fitness podcast with a steadfast commitment to traditional family values, we know that protecting families is important.
Right you are, Eric, but I will note there are some things that are even more important than protecting traditional family values and the moral fabric of our society.
That's right, Greg. It's important to protect families, but it's even more important to protect corporate entities. That's why I joined the advisory board for the Sports Nutrition Association, along with trusted fitness pros like Danny Lennon and distrusted arch nemesis like Eric Helms. The Sports Nutrition Association is the home of sports nutrition. They are dedicated to ensuring the sustainable prosperity of the sports nutrition profession, and they offer a unique pathway to robust insurance coverage for your sports nutrition business. Simply put, it's the best way to protect the corporate entities that are closest to your heart.
And I should note, if you're an individual sole proprietor providing sports nutrition services, and not a corporate entity, the Sports Nutrition Association can help you out as well.
That is correct. All insurance plans are handled individually on a case-by-case basis, regardless of how your sports nutrition business is structured. But even if you don't want insurance coverage, SNA membership comes with a bunch of other perks and advantages. The Sports Nutrition Association is the only global professional sports body that has a defined standard for sports nutrition scope of practice for its members. This ensures that members maintain high standards in their practice so that the public can always trust in the quality associated with the services of an accredited sports nutritionist through the Sports Nutrition Association. If you already meet their minimum education requirements, you can become an accredited sports nutritionist today. If you don't meet those education requirements yet, you can enroll in the certificate program in applied sports nutrition. That allows you to become a provisionally accredited member upon completion. To learn more about the Sports Nutrition Association, head over to www.sportsnutritionassociation.com today. Today's episode is sponsored by the Sports Nutrition Association, and Stronger by Science LLC sincerely appreciates their support. All right, so Greg, moving on to our segments here, what do you have for us today?
Yeah, so I have a how to describe this segment. So I used to do a little segment at the top of the show called Road to the Stage, documenting my weight loss progress. And I recently ticked off a nice little milestone. I am officially below 220 for the first time since August of 2012, I believe. So that's good.
Yeah.
Feeling good.
Awesome.
Quite happy about that. And so I wanted to do a little segment talking a little bit about some of the things that have helped me out along the way with that process, because I've quite publicly been a larger man in the public eye for over a decade at this point, and have quite publicly struggled with weight loss in the past, and a good chunk of my ongoing success this time around has been in so one of the frequent things that I would see said about me on the internet previously was, why should I listen to anything that this person has to say about nutrition if clearly just looking at them, they don't know anything about it, don't know what they're doing, which, honestly, I get it. It is what it is. But a lot of the journey to where I'm at now, I think a lot of what has helped me is not so much learning new things about weight loss. It has been unlearning things that I used to think were absolutely necessary and mandatory, that in a lot of contexts are probably good advice, but that when applied without care and context can, I think, sometimes do more harm than good. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit in this segment. So the title I have for it is Popular Weight Loss Advice That May Do More Harm Than Good. And just to add a little nuance to that, things that are probably in a vacuum pretty decent advice, but can that have a non-trivial risk of leading people astray when applied without context. And so, to be clear, I'm not talking about scams or fad diets or anything like that.
You're not gonna do a whole segment on the grapefruit diet here?
Correct. Yeah. So I'm talking about things that are the sort of advice you would hear from generally well-informed and well-intentioned evidence-based fitness professionals that, like I said, in a vacuum might be very good advice, but that I think are sometimes presented as blanket must-haves that might not always be the case. So I think I think what I'm getting at will become more clear as I get into this segment. And also, so just to kind of start out with some context and background for where a lot of the dietary advice in the like so-called evidence-based fitness community originates, and I mean really just the broader fitness community in general. A lot of it kind of originates with or gets popular with bodybuilders and physique athletes first and foremost, which kind of makes sense. So for people who are bodybuilders, physique athletes, like a huge part of the sport is pursuing what Adam Fisher, our buddy Adam, does support for both Stronger by Science and Macro Factor. Great dude, got absolutely diced in this past year. But what he terms exotic levels of leanness. And, you know, if that is your pursuit, if a big part of your sport is just getting as peeled as you can possibly get, it makes sense that you're more likely than the average person to just like stew on the approaches that might be best suited to accomplishing that pursuit. Because, you know, that's a huge part of your sport. And when you're trying to reach an extreme goal, the details simply matter more. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I also think it makes a lot of sense for just kind of the general fitness public to look towards bodybuilders, physique athletes, bodybuilding coaches, physique coaches for general nutrition advice. You know, even if like there are reasons you might not want to, but just kind of like on a very basic level, it makes sense because, you know, if you're like, that is a population of people who reliably and predictably achieve extreme levels of leanness. Like that's a huge part of what they do. And it's pretty rare for successful bodybuilders to sign up for a show and just show up completely out of shape. You know, they're able to pick months in advance. Hey, I'm doing a show on this date and I need to be incredibly lean by that date. And then they get there. And I think that that's extremely appealing for a lot of people because, you know, the thought process is if they can so reliably and predictably get that lean, and I have, you know, I'm only trying to get down to 15% body fat, or like for the women listening, like, you know, 25% body fat, something like that. Like if they can get that peeled, then their advice certainly has to be good enough to help me get to where I'm trying to go on a reasonable timeline, you know?
Yeah, and we see that with other domains as well, where like you'll see people who are like trying to get tips for running their like one person sole proprietorship type business, and they're like, I'm going to read a book by someone who runs a Fortune 500 company with like 70,000 employees about how to manage a company. And it's like, well, yeah, like those strategies certainly can help you manage an enormous company, but you might not necessarily need that for your sole proprietorship or for like a tiny business that has like 2 contractors.
Yeah, for sure. So, a point that I'm going to attempt to make in this segment is that some of that advice might be unnecessary at best or counterproductive at worst for people who aren't pursuing as extreme of goals. And just as one final like little bit of framing before diving in, the context of this segment is I'm talking about people who are trying to lose a significant amount of weight and keep it off. So I'm not necessarily talking about advice for people who are going into a weight loss attempt with the intention of kind of doing cyclical bulks and cuts. You know, you're going to lose 20 pounds, trying to get super lean, and then you're going to regain 20, 30 pounds in the off season to try to build more muscle and then get lean again. You know, like which I'll note, like, that's also like a kind of common piece of advice a lot of people give, which also just directly comes from bodybuilders, which I don't know if that's necessary for everyone. But people with those sort of who are intending to take a cyclical approach to weight management, that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about folks who are trying to lose, you know, 10, 20, 30 pounds and keep it off in perpetuity.
Yep.
With that out of the way, let's dive in. So ultimately, I think a successful weight loss diet, kind of for that purpose, lose the weight and keep it off, is going to need to have 3 characteristics. One, you need to be able to stick to it to help you stay in an energy deficit for a long enough period of time to lose the weight you want to lose. Number 2, it needs to support other goals you have beyond weight loss per se. Like if you're working out, you need to have energy for working out. Trying to maintain muscle, you need to be able to maintain muscle. Needs to be able to gel with your social life to some extent. All of those things. And number 3, and perhaps most importantly, certainly very important, whatever you do needs to set you up for success at the end of your diet. Because again, you're trying to lose the weight and keep it off. So it's not just, trying to sprint to lose 20 pounds and then you just find yourself on kind of the yo-yo diet roller coaster, lose the weight, gain it all back. You want to be able to build the necessary skills and lifestyle around what you're doing, that when you lose weight, you'll be able to maintain that and keep it off. So the first idea I would like to talk about, the first piece of popular advice that I think often might be okay advice in a vacuum, but that often does more harm than good when just given as blanket advice to everyone, is the pursuit of rigid macro counting. And I'm not going to get super in depth on this because I know you've talked about this on the podcast quite a bit before, but I'll note on the front end that a rigid approach to macro counting makes a lot of sense for bodybuilders in a lot of contexts. So first, the general rigidity of it. Having carb, fat, protein targets that you try to stick to every day with minimal or ideally no deviations from them. That makes a lot of sense when you're on a strict timeline where you need to get super diced for a show on a particular date.
Yeah.
There is an end date for that diet, and you better get there. Otherwise, there's not much room for error, and you just kind of make a fool of yourself on stage. Which, that's not what you're doing, So
Yeah.
The rigidity, like a rigid approach to macro counting, can certainly make a lot of sense for bodybuilders from that perspective. And also just the approach to macro counting in particular. So, not just trying to keep an eye on, say, total calorie and protein intake, but really trying to keep an eye on each particular macronutrient, having carb targets for the day, fat targets for the day, and really not trying to deviate from them much at all. I also think that makes a lot of sense for specifically bodybuilders trying to get super lean. So protein, obvious, that's going to help support muscle maintenance, or maybe even gaining a little bit at the start of the diet. Need to have plenty of protein. Fat makes sense, like having a strict fat target. Fat's important for absorbing fat-soluble vitamins, maintaining hormone production, etc. Carb intake, also very important. You need energy to fuel your training. And the thing is, if someone is pursuing exotic levels of leanness, you find yourself with very little margin for error at the end of a diet. Like you're not going to be eating as much of anything as you would like to, but you might be dealing with something where if you don't hit, like, your fat target is really low, your carb target is really low, and if you eat 10 more grams of fat than you had allotted for yourself, well, now carb intake is so low that your already shitty training session is just going to be even shittier, or
what's that saying? Is it robbing Peter to pay Paul?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. When you're dieting in a bodybuilding context, toward the end, every time you add one macro, you're like, I'm paying for this somewhere else.
Yeah. Exactly. And the inverse as well. Like if you eat 30 more grams of carbs than you were supposed to, and that comes out of your fat budget, you might be looking at weeks at a time where you're really consuming such low fat intake that it's quite unhealthy. So the really, really strict approach to macro counting and really focusing on each macro makes a lot of sense in that context. But I think that can be counterproductive for a lot of folks who have other goals beyond just getting diced for a bodybuilding show. First, it's just generally unnecessary. Like our general perspective is that for most people, just tracking protein and total calories is fine. Most people's hedonic preferences will wind them up with enough fat intake to support fat-soluble vitamin absorption, hormone production, enough carb intake to support training. And, you're not going to be finding yourself in the sort of situation where everything is just so low that those trade-offs get really extreme. Also, like the idea of really rigid macro counting, you've talked about this a lot before, the difference between rigid and flexible cognitive restraint. A lot of people refer to all macro counting approaches as flexible dieting because you have a lot of flexibility with food choice. But if you're, if you're pursuing 3 numbers that you have to hit every day with very, very little room for error, that just gives you a lot more opportunities to fail and lose motivation. An in-depth discussion of maintaining motivation over the course of an entire diet, that's probably a little bit outside the scope of this segment. But just in kind of broad terms, if you're setting goals for yourself that are challenging but achievable and you're hitting them consistently, that can help build and sustain motivation as you move forward. But, if you're putting yourself in a situation where you're setting goals and targets for yourself that aren't strictly necessary for the pursuit of your goal, and you're giving yourself more opportunities to at least perceive what you're doing to be failing, if you're saying, man, I got to get within 10 grams of my carb target and 5 grams of my fat target every day while maintaining some semblance of a normal life, that's going to be quite challenging. A lot of people who aren't, pursuing a diet with the single-minded focus of a bodybuilder, like a lot of times you're just not going to do that. And then you feel like a failure. And then you might hit the kind of fuck it point and say, well, I already went 10 grams over on my fat. Today's already a failure. So I'm just going to eat everything in sight because I already failed today. Like that's the situation you can find yourself with really rigid cognitive restraint. And it's just not necessary.
Yeah, I think the term you used there was the fuck it point.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the research I've seen the what the hell effect, and I'm wondering why they went with that one instead of your preferred version.
I mean, the similar connotations, I would say.
No, it's exactly the same thing, but one is more printable in textbooks.
Yes. And then finally, so with kind of the framing device, 3 things for an important diet: you can stick to it, supports your goals beyond weight loss per se, and sets you up for success at the end of your diet. I don't know that losing weight with really, really rigid macro counting necessarily does a great job of setting people up for success at the end of their diet, because it does take really rigid cognitive restraint to do it. And most people don't want to do that forever. If you're able to pull it off for 16 weeks, 6 months, whatever, you might very successfully lose the weight that you're trying to lose. But most people don't want to come within 5 grams of a protein, carb, and fat target every single day for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
So if that does sound like something that you would enthusiastically do for the next 50 years, then go for it. But if you look at that and say, damn, I really don't want to do that every day for the next 50 years, then this might be an approach to weight loss that ultimately isn't setting you up for long-term success, because it's not the skills you're developing to pursue that type of diet aren't the skills you would need to then be able to kind of transition to a more normal way of eating and ultimately keep the weight off.
Yeah, if I could add a couple things here.
Yeah, go for it.
Number one, you mentioned that a really in-depth discussion of meeting goals and supporting or facilitating motivation, sustained motivation,
Mm-hmm.
is a little bit outside the scope of this particular segment. There's 2 articles I would direct readers to. One is strongerbyscience.com/goal setting.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is macrofactorapp.com/cheat meals. Both of those go into more detail about sustaining motivation, motivational collapse in the context of overeating and rigid dietary targets and things like that. So I would recommend that for further detail if anyone's interested. Another thing, I think a lot of people might be confused when they hear this and say, okay, well, I've looked at the literature and it says that for long-term weight loss success, some form of dietary tracking and just general monitoring practices seem to be correlated with success in the long run. And so people might be hearing this and saying, well, what gives? If monitoring is facilitating long-term success, why would very precise monitoring be perhaps not the best approach? And ultimately, I think if I could draw on an anecdote, I was helping out with a study where that was a collaboration with a weight loss clinic. And we would have, basically participants would come back when they hit a certain marker, when they kind of hit the next milestone in their weight loss. And it was starting to become really clear the people that were like cruising through it and the people that were really struggling. And as a researcher, you're in the room with them, right? You have the opportunity to chat, make some small talk, and kind of pick their brain a little bit. And one of the things that jumped out to me was the really successful people who were cruising through it and maintaining it long term. They were doing a lot of the basic monitoring practices that we talk about. They were keeping an eye on body weight, and they were tracking consistently but not rigidly. And I think that is the big distinction that you're getting at here is you want to track consistently, but you don't want to be super rigid about hitting 3 exact numbers precisely for the rest of your life. And when I talk with these folks, what they seem to do, broadly speaking, is fall into a comfortable pattern where they're consistently checking in on body weight, not hyper fixated on it, but just keeping an eye on it, and they are tracking their calories, maybe tracking protein as well. This population wasn't doing a lot of lifting, so the protein was kind of secondary.
Yeah.
But what would happen is if they started to see weight creeping up a little bit, then they would say, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I need to tighten up my tracking a little, and get it from kind of cruise control into like, hey, it looks like things are starting to drift a little bit. I'm aware of that early because I've been monitoring body weight, and now I can take my tracking precision from a 7 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10. And for most applications, you really don't have to crank into that absolute highest gear where you're precisely and rigidly tracking carbohydrate and fat and protein, unless you're trying to get to that term you've been using of exotically lean.
Yeah. And also, I mean, like, unless there's a date at which you have to achieve a certain body weight or a certain physique or anything like that, even just like adherence to the targets is more of like a fuzzy concept instead of just like you have to hit the numbers dead on the head every day. So like, as an example, if someone's trying to lose about a pound a week, give or take, that's going to come with an energy deficit of around 500 calories per day on average or so. And so ultimately, if you say need to lose exactly 20 pounds in 20 weeks to get to, whatever physique you're trying to achieve for a bodybuilding show, then like, yeah, you need to achieve that deficit every single day or that cumulative deficit every single week to get where you're trying to go at the exact date you need to get there. If if it's more about long-term weight loss and hey, like what, I'm going to get there eventually and then I'm going to try to stay here and maintain it for the next 20 years or whatever. That's just unnecessary.
Yeah.
If there's a day or two a week where you just say, you know what, there's a lot of other things going on. I have a social event coming up. I just don't feel like being in a deficit today. You can just eat at your maintenance intake. like 1 or 2 days per week. For the week, you're still in a cumulative energy deficit. It's still going to be moving you towards your goal. Maybe not at your intended rate, but it's still ultimately progress, you know? Or, this is also something I see a lot just when people discuss this on the internet, where, you know, maybe their daily calorie target, like even if they're not tracking macros super rigidly, their daily calorie target is like 1,700 calories or something. They're trying to lose a pound a week. And they're like, man, like I hit 1,800 calories today. I hit 1,900 calories today. I feel like a failure. But it's like, dude, like that's still a 300-400 calorie deficit. Like that is still a directionally appropriate thing you did. And I think that if folks were able to take a step back and, you know, adopt a mindset of flexible restraint instead of rigid restraint, that they would see that is still a win. Like this was still a very good day. You know, perhaps not the absolute optimal conceivable day given what I'm trying to do and the rate I'm trying to do it at, but it's still good. And I think with the really, really rigid restraint, you find yourself in a situation where you end up reframing small wins into unqualified losses. And that is not a recipe for success.
No, I mean, that's a great example. And it reminds me, one time I was working with a client and there was just stuff going on in life where really meticulous tracking and pushing the deficit hard just wasn't really in the cards for a stretch of time. And I could tell they were starting to get a little bit disappointed with some of the, you know, they're like, I haven't been losing weight lately, but weight loss was the goal. And it was starting to kind of get internally framed mentally as failure. Mm-hmm. And my biggest thing was like, well, wait a minute, let's take a step back. We're like 17 kilograms below where we started.
Yeah.
Maintaining your weight 17 kilograms below where we started is an unqualified success.
Yeah.
You know, so like, even if you do run into those areas of friction, I know we're talking about a slightly different thing here in terms of timescales, but like, yeah, I mean, if you were shooting for a 600 calorie deficit and you hit a 250 calorie deficit, you're still in a deficit. You know, if you were hoping to lose, you know, 3 pounds this week, well, that's not a good example, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
You set the goal of what the optimal target is, but like if you're still directionally moving in the right place or way further along than where you started, it is important to kind of take a step back and look at the broader picture and say, it's really hard to call this a failure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, I'm talking about this because the excuse I'm using is that I recently hit that weight loss milestone. And so like for my experience with this diet and plenty of diets that had failed in the past, I did previously do what I thought I was supposed to do. You know, I know a reasonable amount about nutrition. I could calculate like what my protein target should be. You know, how many carbs I needed to support the training I was doing, the rest coming from fat. It was plenty of fat to support vitamin absorption, hormone production. I was like, okay, cool. Like I've got my numbers. I did all of this the right way. And now if I'm serious about my results, I just need to stick to them. And, you know, I would do a pretty decent job of sticking to them for a while. And then as soon as motivation started flagging a little bit and I started missing the numbers, I would just start to feel like a failure and just kind of like hit that fuck it point. Whereas like for this attempt, like I still have those same ebbs and flows of motivation, but there's been no motivational collapse.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes I'm losing weight exactly at the rate I'm intending to. Sometimes I'm still heading in the right direction, but at half of my intended rate. Sometimes there's just a lot of shit going on and I don't want to be dieting. I don't want to be in an energy deficit. And I mean, that's coming up. Holidays are coming up. Birthday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. Dude, I'm not going to be trying to lose a pound a week through all of that. So just take a break, be in maintenance for a while, and it's okay. And so it's set me up in a position where, you know, I can do a better job of savoring my successes, and it's more a matter of just kind of qualitatively assessing was this a big win? Was this a small win? Or, if I do go way over my targets one day, it's a learning experience, like one day it's impossible for one day to be that big of a setback unless I allow it to be a setback and snowball, just adopting more flexible restraint has been huge. So that first one went longer than I expected it to, but I thought that was a good conversation.
Yeah.
Moving on, though, this one will absolutely be short because it more or less restates your segment from the last episode of the podcast where you were talking about protein intake targets. So the second bit of advice that I think might be generally good advice in a vacuum, but that sometimes can do more harm than good when just applied as a blanket statement is giving people or telling people that they should select like quite high protein targets. So like I said, for an in-depth discussion of this, dear audience, refer to the previous episode. But yeah, with high protein targets, for bodybuilders, it can make a lot of sense. Like taking a better safe than sorry approach to protein intake, because protein intake is very important for maintaining muscle mass in an energy deficit. And it gets more and more important the leaner and leaner someone gets. If you're going from, 40% body fat to 35% body fat at a, reasonable rate of weight loss, you got a resistance training stimulus in there, you don't have to worry about losing muscle. When you're taking off the last 5 pounds before a show and going from 8% to 5% body fat, then you probably do need to worry about it quite a bit more. And, again, the whole point of the sport is to be as muscular as possible and as lean as possible. And so if you can, if eating a little bit more protein can help you maintain an additional half pound of muscle over the course of a diet, that could be the difference in placing at a show. So it makes more sense to kind of give people better safe than sorry type protein targets. And for most people, there just aren't those same sets of concerns. So like we talked about in the last episode, well, I say we, like Eric talked about in the last episode, the difference between a protein target of like 1.2, 1.3 grams per kilogram and say 2.2 grams per kilogram or above just doesn't seem to be particularly large or particularly, we don't super consistently observe that there even is a difference to begin with in the literature. Like if you start getting down to a gram per kilo or below, like that certainly seems like it will probably have deleterious effects for the amount of muscle you'll maintain if you're in a deficit, the amount of muscle you'll gain in a surplus. But, it seems like pretty moderate protein intakes probably get the job done pretty well for most people most of the time. Previously, again, I used to just use that old heuristic of a gram per pound, just 2.2 grams per kilo. And I really found that just didn't work for me. One of the big considerations here, again, with just like a successful diet is you need to be able to stick with it. And it also needs to accommodate the rest of your life, and it needs to set you up for success at the end of a diet. And I found that, when I was trying to get more than a gram per pound of protein, that basically necessitated a lot of chicken breast, a lot of protein shakes, and just like a lot of foods that I didn't particularly like. And like I have it easier than a lot of people do because like I'm an omnivore. Like it's going to be harder for a vegetarian or a vegan. And like, I also just don't have that many social things I do. But if you're going out with friends a lot to restaurants and whatnot, having a lot of meals with family, and you're trying to get in a gram per pound of protein with a lot of food options that are like fattier, higher carb, then the choices you'll have to make to hit that protein target will probably be reasonably incompatible with actually staying in an energy deficit in the first place, and will often require kind of trade-offs and choices that lock you into a diet that you probably won't want to stick with for the next 50 years. It seemed like you wanted to say something.
I was just kind of smiling because I've heard of anecdotes where people will be like in bodybuilding prep and they'll be like, yeah, I want to go out to eat with the family, but I have to, this is especially people who set really, really, really high protein targets. And they're like, yeah, so I went to this restaurant and I said, boil me 2 chicken breasts and then steam me some vegetables. And if I even smell butter near those vegetables, I will walk back into the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
Like they just create this like special order and they spend like $30 on the absolute shittiest dinner they've ever eaten. So when you were talking about how like a lot of times people do kind of feel like they're pushed into this situation, even outside of a restaurant scenario where they're like, okay, it's the end of the day or close to the end. I feel completely satiated. I'm fine. I don't feel like eating, but I've only had 1.4 grams per kilogram of protein per day. And therefore, in order to hit my protein target, I'm going to have another meal just to check that box. And in that meal, to make that protein palatable, I'm going to also bring in additional carbohydrate and fat. And it can get to the situation where it's like, that was ultimately, if the goal was fat loss, you probably didn't even really need that extra bump to get you above 1.4 that day. And you just invited all these other calories that just chipped away at your deficit for no good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you ultimately do need to consume enough protein, like not trying to state that protein intake is completely unimportant. But I do think a lot of people, myself included, find that somewhat lower protein targets are just more compatible with the way that they want to eat and the way that they can see themselves eating for the rest of their lives. Not most people don't want to live on a diet of protein shakes and boneless, skinless chicken breasts and broccoli in perpetuity.
Yeah.
And I mean, also, man, with inflation being what it is, a lot of protein-rich foods are kind of expensive. So if money's tight, dropping down from 2.2 to 1.4, like there might be some non-trivial cost savings associated with that as well.
Well, no, I mean, you always hear, like, especially like in the US, you hear college-aged folks who are trying to build muscle and they're like, yeah, I'm trying to bulk, but it's so expensive. The vast majority of that expense is their protein.
Yeah.
The vast majority.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, like my issue with this bit of advice isn't necessarily the advice itself in a vacuum. My issue is more with how it's often like framed and messaged. So, for example, I think that saying something like, as long as you're getting in about 1.2, 1.3 grams per kilo, you're fine, but aiming for 1.6 may not be a bad idea if it's feasible for you. I think that's perfectly fine. That seems to be in keeping with the evidence. It's not setting 1.6 grams per kilo as a rigid and flexible target you have to shoot for. But if 1.6 or above is in keeping with someone's preferences, I'm sure they don't lose anything by getting up that high. Whereas the way I often see it framed is just, you got to get in 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo, and bad things will happen if you don't. And I do think that the advice about protein, when framed that way, has the potential to do more harm than good.
Yeah, I think that's totally accurate. And one of the things that made me smile is, like, you had mentioned like a moderate protein intake. But what's kind of convenient is that this like 1.2 gram per kilogram general area, like a lot of Americans end up there unintentionally.
Yeah.
Like if you read the public health literature, sometimes you'll get like these really panicky papers that say Americans are overeating protein and it's a huge problem. And it's like, oh yeah, we found that they're eating like 1.2. So a lot of people who are embarking on a diet might be at the kind of tail end of this range, just based on their dietary preferences alone, and they might not have to really make any major changes to get into that 1.2 range.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so moving on, the fourth bit of advice that I think makes a ton of sense for bodybuilders, which is where a lot of this stuff originates, but may not be the best just kind of blanket advice for people to give or receive, is the advice that I see commonly in a lot of circles, that if you're trying to set up a diet to lose weight, one of the things that you should really try to prioritize is eating basically as bland of foods as you can stomach. And so for bodybuilders, that kind of makes sense. So so the thinking behind this bit of advice is that human energy intake is regulated by a lot of different things, but specifically for feeding behavior or eating behavior, you have hedonic and non-hedonic eating. And non-hedonic eating seems to be, in large part, just kind of your body integrating a lot of signals related to fuel availability, satiety, long-term energy status, etc., and trying to like tune your appetite to consume enough calories for survival. But then, we humans, we're not just we're not just basically amoebas responding to just cues from our environment about how much we need to eat to survive. We also have food science and a lot of delicious ingredients and highly processed foods that taste very good that you want to eat in large quantities. And I'm sure everyone listening to this has eaten more than they really wanted to at some point just because the food was delicious. And that is hedonic eating. And so if all of the food you eat in your diet doesn't like really trigger that hedonic response, that can help cut down on hedonic eating and large deviations from your dietary goals and targets. And I think that is the sort of thing that can be quite important for bodybuilders as they're trying to get very lean. Because I think just from talking to people who've been there, like your brain can kind of get in a state where you haven't eaten much that's really tasted good in a long time. And when something very yummy is put in front of you, a lot of people, like, even if they generally have like a pretty normal relationship with food otherwise, just kind of just attack highly palatable, very hedonic food like a feral animal when they're like super, super lean. So that's it makes sense for that population.
It gets different.
Yeah.
There's a great paper. If I remember, I'll try to link it in the show notes, but it's about the participants in the Minnesota starvation experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does get different when you start getting really, really lean. If you read that paper, they don't say, "Oh, when they got lean, boy, did they sure get hungry." It's psychosis. I mean, it is like psychological, like things are different.
Mm-hmm.
Like in that study, they were like, okay, if you want to chew gum just to kind of have, something in your mouth and a little bit of flavor, go for it. And then they were eating just dozens of packs of gum a day. And they're like, okay, you can't do the gum anymore, right?
Yeah.
They would find that people were just kind of so fixated on food and just kind of like obsessing over, thinking about, I've heard anecdotes of bodybuilders who aggregate and collect cooking supplies and
Mm-hmm.
recipes that they know they can't use for the next 4 months. There are really pathological, psychological kind of changes that can happen. In the vast majority of cases, they are transient and acute, and then once you kind of get back into the swing of things, they go away. But there's for bodybuilders, there is an application of this because you will find that when you're in that kind of semi-starvation state and you have a level of food fixation that's very atypical for you, and you kind of open the floodgates by having, I guess I'll have a bite of that. you can't really put that back in.
Yeah.
You know, once it's out of the bag, like stuff has a tendency to go kind of haywire.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other very important thing to note is, again, with bodybuilders, you're talking about a time limited diet. You're really going to cinch things down really tight for a period of months to get in insane condition for a show. And that's it. Then you go back to eating other stuff. But again, if the goal is to lose weight and keep it off long term, that's not really what you're doing. You're trying to build skills that you can transfer to the rest of your life. And so I think that I think that this advice can make sense if it's not taken to the extreme. So a lot of people run into trouble with over consuming like hyper palatable foods and a ton of just like really, really highly processed refined foods. So I'm certainly not saying like, oh yeah, like your goal when you're trying to lose weight and keep it off is try to figure out how you can be in an energy deficit while consuming the maximum number of Pop-Tarts possible. Like that's certainly not what I'm saying. But I think that the value of pursuing blandness of food for its own sake probably isn't a great thing to pursue for a couple reasons. One is that for most people, that's just going to harm adherence with your diet. Like we live in a world with a lot of food options and a lot of really yummy food options. And if you're a bodybuilder and you're, you need to get on stage in Speedos in 3 months and look a certain way when that's like you need to look a certain way on a certain date. I think that helps a lot with adherence, like, because you don't want to make a fool of yourself in front of your peers in the sport. But I mean, for a lot of folks, if you say like, hey, I'm just going to have the most bland food possible in my house all the time, and that's the only thing that I'm going to eat on my diet, and then you stop in a gas station and see the snacks, you need to go to the store, you drive by a restaurant, walk by a restaurant, whatever, and there are just so many other much, much more delicious food options there, and you don't have the same sort of like extreme external pressure forcing you to adhere to your diet, then you're going to find adherence is just more challenging, because everything else that is very easily available for you to eat just tastes better than what you're trying to force yourself to eat. This is also going to conflict a lot with social situations. So if you get in the mindset that I can only adhere to my diet and not go off the rails if I'm only eating bland food, then like if you find yourself in a social situation where you like quote unquote have to eat more palatable food, like that might fuck with your head a little bit, make it easier to kind of go off the rails. And then lastly, like again, a big theme here is the process of losing weight should be a learning process for developing the skills that will transfer to the rest of your life. And I mean, I don't think most people want to live on chicken breast and rice for 50 years, So there is kind of a process you have to go through of whatever food you find, like, not hyper processed, not hyper palatable, but tastes good. Like it's good, palatable food that you enjoy eating. Like you need to be able to consume that in moderation and find something you can stick to, So the fixation on just like only eating bland foods and just the blandest stuff that you can stomach, I don't think sets most people up for long-term success.
Yeah, and there's one kind of assumption that is usually tied to that recommendation, which is like, okay, you are doing a bodybuilding style diet, which means that we assume that the calorie intake and macro intake is fixed, right? And so then it just becomes, well, should I try to eat really, really tasty stuff to hit that fixed set of macros, or some kind of more bland stuff? And the thought process is generally like, well, when you're eating the really hyper palatable stuff, you're still eating the same amount, but it's just going to be a tragedy when the meal ends. You're going to be like, I don't want to stop. It's like, well, why put yourself through that? Just eat some stuff that's a little bit more boring. You're hitting the same macros anyway. It'll just make your life a little less painful for this short-term kind of diet. But when people try to use this advice in a scenario where macros are not fixed, they're not going to get on stage in 12 weeks. So they're like, sometimes you'll see people who say, you know what? I'm afraid that if I eat that cookie, I'm going to eat 300 calories or 400 calories worth of cookies. So I'm going to keep to the bland chicken breast and broccoli and rice. And what they'll do is they'll eat a serving of that, and it clearly didn't scratch the itch that they were going for with that kind of hedonic feeding urge.
Yeah.
And they say, well, maybe if I just eat more of this bland stuff, it'll scratch that itch. And it usually doesn't. And so like one of two situations is actually pretty common when food intake is not rigidly fixed as it would be for bodybuilders, which is either in order to avoid the 400 calorie cookie splurge, you eat 400 calories worth of this other stuff. And in terms of energy balance, you end up in the same place.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other is instead of to try to avoid that 400 calorie cookie splurge, you eat like 300 calories worth of the boring stuff and then say, that didn't really work. I'm going to have the damn cookies anyway. And then it becomes additive rather than replacing. So sometimes people will think I can basically tune out my hedonic urge to eat by really leaning into eating stuff that will satisfy satiety signals. And they're not completely separate, but they are different. They're distinct.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people think that, well, if I just get full or nearly full, I won't have this hedonic urge to eat anymore. And that rarely seems to be the case. So in scenarios where calories aren't fixed, it's not just that this advice isn't as useful. It can actually sometimes directly backfire in terms of just the sheer amount of energy intake.
Oh, absolutely. And then, so the final thing I have on this list of advice that I think is sometimes good in a vacuum. In this case, I think it's advice that really is just good for bodybuilders, and really isn't that good in a vacuum otherwise, but certainly isn't helpful for most people, is a focus on the outcome of a diet rather than the process of a diet, and particularly kind of time-based and time-limited outcome goals. And I think that a lot of times this isn't directly stated, but it's kind of tacitly implied by the sort of content people put out and the sort of advice that people give, even if they're not like explicitly saying to focus on these things. So, in terms of focusing on outcomes, this is a very visually driven industry. Like people who talk about physique stuff, people who talk about nutrition, like there's this saying, like your body is your business card, which should it be? I don't know, maybe not, but I mean, it is. That's that if you're a professional in this field, and you have a much, much better physique than most of your peers, that's probably going to help your bottom line. And so it makes sense to put that front and center. But what does that tacitly communicate to your audience? Like it tacitly communicates like looking this way is valuable and this is what you should want. Like you should try to be focusing on this outcome. Also, just in terms of how people sell their services, like before and afters are huge, which again makes sense. Like people like to see someone who looks similar to them before, and then 4 months later they have a physique that they would kill for. So, but again, before and afters, without further context, that is just a focus on the outcome of a diet, not necessarily the process. And then it's still pretty common to see people who are doing like general health and fitness coaching with a nutrition component, do challenges where it's like, hey, I'm putting together a group and we're all going to try to lose 20 pounds in 6 weeks or whatever, which again, that is a focus on a time-based outcome. And I think a lot of this for bodybuilders makes all the sense in the world. That is literally the sport. You start your diet on a certain day, your show is on a certain day, you got to look a certain way by that day. Like The outcome, the physique itself, that is your sport, and doing it in a fixed amount of time, that is what the sport entails. But I don't think that is really helpful advice to trickle down to virtually anyone else. The time it does make sense is if someone's a strength athlete and they're trying to like cut to the next lowest weight class, because then it's sort of the same deal. You know, you need to be below a certain body weight on a certain date for weighing in. But otherwise, like, yeah, no, that's just not that's not helpful. So I do think that it might be a little bit useful on the front end because, you know, people want what they want and they want it now. They don't want to. If you tell someone like, hey, you can have the physique you want in 4 months, or we're going to focus on the process, maybe you get there in 4 months, maybe you get there in 2 years. Just as a sales pitch, we're going to get there in 4 months is way, way more appealing. But then once you actually get into it, it circles back to a lot of the things we've been talking about to this point. Like if you're trying to lose X amount of weight in X weeks, and you fall behind and you really have a rigid end date, you know, now you have created for yourself a potential vector for failure where one doesn't need to exist. Like if it's more of an open-ended thing, you're just trying to lose weight, you're focusing on the process of building the skills necessary to stay in an energy deficit, do it in a way that's feasible and sustainable for you, building the skills to maintain that weight loss at the end of a diet. You know, maybe you fall a little bit behind schedule, so to speak, but you're learning a lot through that entire process. And with a process orientation rather than a outcome orientation, it gives you just more just room and grace, I suppose, to build those skills and to interpret setbacks and falling behind schedule and all of that stuff less as a failure, less as an indication that you are likely to fall short of your goal of achieving a certain look or a certain amount of weight loss by a particular date or in a certain period of time. And it's easier to reframe those as learning opportunities. Like if you had some strategies that had been working well for you to stay in an energy deficit, everything seemed pretty feasible. And then just for a week, the wheels fall off. You're finding it really, really challenging to stick to your dietary targets. You have a ton of cravings, energy's low, diet's just really going poorly. You can either step back and say, oh no, like I'm trying to reach this goal in 12 weeks. And instead of moving forward for a week, I've moved back for a week. So now I'm functionally trying to reach the same goal I had before, but only in 10 weeks because I just took a step back. And this week was already so hard. Like I'm already regressing. So like now I have to be even more aggressive to get where I'm trying to go on a certain date. And it like that's not a recipe for success. Like it's no wonder why people lose their motivation when they have that mindset if they hit any speed bumps whatsoever. And I mean, newsflash, you're going to hit speed bumps. But if it's more of like a process-oriented thing, you're not quite as focused on the outcome, certainly not in a time-limited space, you can step back and say, hey, this week was shit. Why did this happen? You know, maybe some of the strategies that had been working up to this point are becoming less effective. Maybe it's just other stuff going on in my life and I need to give myself some grace and get out of a deficit, be in maintenance for a while. Like I don't need one more stressor in my life right now. Everything else is crazy. But I can take the lessons I've learned to this point, and once things calm down, use all of that to get back on track. It's just not a helpful orientation, just the extreme time-based, outcome-focused approach to weight loss.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that, you know, some people have asked us why the default behavior and macro factor is. So for example, if you go 400 calories over your target on Monday, why doesn't the app pull that out of Tuesday, or maybe pull it out of like Tuesday and Wednesday? And if you want, you can make the app behave that way. You know, there's a way to do it, but it's not the default behavior. And it's exactly because of what you said. It's like in most cases, when you had a target and you went well above it, that means that there might have been some challenge leading into that discrepancy between target and observed intake. And the last thing we need to do is say, you know how it was so hard to hit this target yesterday that you went 400 above it? Guess what? That challenge might still be present, but it's going to be even harder because now in the presence of this slip up, we're going to tighten the screws even more.
Yeah.
And it's not just that we're going to get back on the horse, but we're actually shifting the targets downward to make it even harder to get there. And like you said, if you get really locked into that short time scale, outcome focused, time dependent goal, you start to put yourself in a situation where it can become immensely overwhelming and stressful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's the same thing with how like goal progression works in Macro Factor as well. Like, when you set a goal, the app tells you essentially like, hey, if you stick to this rate of weight loss or weight gain, but we're talking about weight loss in this segment. If you stick to this precise rate of weight loss, this is the date at which you'll reach your goal. And I think some users expect us to like enforce that end date rather than the updates to be informative, like, hey, to continue losing weight at the rate you want to, this is what you should aim for. And they'll say like, hey, I was trying to lose 20 pounds in 10 weeks and I'm 5 weeks in and I've only lost 6 pounds and the app isn't dropping my calories really low to try to get me there by what I thought my end date would be. And it's kind of the same deal, if like diets get harder the longer you do them. And if it has been like, if it was already a challenge to lose 10 pounds in the first 5 weeks, like if you already fell behind that timeline, odds are pretty low that we could increase the target rate of weight loss by 50% and still get you to 20 pounds in 10 weeks. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, ultimately we want success to snowball, but we want to be able to put the brakes on setbacks before they can snowball into like true robust failures.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that a really outcome focused, time-based approach to weight loss inverts that. Where, if you're rewarded for anything, like getting ahead of schedule, that involves eating even less than your targets, losing more weight quicker, and like you're functionally rewarded for being extra restrictive. And then if you fall behind again because you were like, it's just fucking hard to stay in a consistent energy deficit. If you find that challenging on the front end of a diet, if you then make the diet even harder as you go along, like you're putting people in aggregate in a scenario where you can't get that far ahead. It's hard to feel that good about the success that you're achieving. But boy, if you fall behind, instead of putting the brakes on those deviations and small failures, like they can really snowball into just full on motivational collapse.
Yeah.
So yeah, really the point I'm trying to make in broad strokes with this segment is that I think a lot of the advice that is given in the fitness industry from well-informed, well-intentioned people tacitly has kind of the underlying assumption that food has little value for its own sake, that you'll always be able to stick to your diet, and that you're aiming to get as lean as humans are capable of getting. So in essence, the advice, kind of the tacit underlying assumption is if you perfectly execute on all of these things, you will get diced. And really the optimal body composition outcome is the only thing that matters. And therefore, this is good advice that you should follow. And if those assumptions are true, then yeah, it's good advice that you should follow. But that is not how most folks are. food does have value beyond the physique it can help you achieve. It tastes good. There's social value to it, cultural value to it. The assumption that everyone will always perfectly stick to their diet, that is quantifiably a bad assumption. So it's less about saying, hey, I'm going to assume everyone listening to this advice is robots, and with that assumption, I will tell them how to perfectly achieve their physique goals. Those aren't the people in your audience, like it is more about helping people develop strategies to do good enough for long enough to get where they're trying to go and then be able to sustain it. So I think for most people, the stakes and ultimate goals of a diet are different than they are for bodybuilders and bodybuilding prep coaches. And quote unquote good enough is good enough. And the real goal is that you're aiming to build skills that will help you maintain weight loss, and you're aiming to find a style of eating that you would be happy to stick with for the rest of your life. And so I think that's the lens as a consumer of information that you should view advice through. Something that might be excellent advice if you could do it for the rest of your life might also be advice that you just have no interest in implementing for the rest of your life. And if that's the case, it's probably not advice that you want to implement while attempting to lose weight, because ultimately you're going to have to drop that and do something else once you lose the weight, and now it's time to maintain that weight loss. So I think it's generally a better approach to focus on those things and build those skills along the way, instead of separating kind of diet life from post-diet maintenance life. Like it's a process of finding something that once you get out of the diet, you're perfectly happy to eat the exact same way you were during the diet, or very, very similar, with the sole exception of, hey, now you can eat a little bit more.
Yeah. I think this is great advice. The one thing I would add to it, which I assume that you would agree with, is, we've talked in recent weeks a lot about inter-individual variation and response variability. And the underlying premise of those conversations is that different people are, in fact, different people. And they will respond to things a little bit differently. And I know that just from observations, like you and I have very different dieting experiences. The way that we approach it, the things that help us succeed are quite different. And so I would say that for the vast majority of people, what you're saying here is going to lead them in a better direction than just the kind of standard approach, which is, let me take bodybuilding advice and apply it to a much different weight loss scenario. But I would encourage people, if some of these things based on your experience have helped you, that's okay. You don't have to work your way toward the norm if you have past experience or you've experimented with some things and found, I kind of respond differently than most folks. So like, for example, I've tried to do really laid back approaches to dieting, and I struggle with them because I've done a lot of reflecting on this, because I look at the literature that says exactly what you're saying. Exactly. And I'm like, but it doesn't match my reality. Yeah. And I've done a lot of reflecting on that. And I think what I've come to find is that perhaps because of my dieting history, if I take a really relaxed approach to weight loss dieting, it doesn't get into the sweet spot of goal setting where it's challenging enough to excite me.
Yeah.
And so it's not that I get demotivated by falling short of the goal. It's that I get demotivated because the goal is not yet exciting enough to me. It's not challenging enough to get my foot in the door and to get rolling with it.
Yeah.
And so like some people might find things like that, or some people might find, for me, in the way that I eat, I'm just really sensitive to hyper palatable foods, even if I'm not absolutely shredded. And so for me, it's best to kind of keep things at no more than like a 7 out of 10 on that like hyper palatability scale. Some people might find like high protein maybe for you, hedonic eating is not a challenge during your dieting process, but satiety is something you really struggle with. And you find that maybe even going above 2.2 grams per kilogram helps you. I think
or it could just meet your food preferences better.
Exactly.
I mean,
yeah.
Some people just really, really love a ton of very lean, protein-rich foods. I don't know how. Makes no sense to me, but those people exist, and I'm certainly not going to tell them they're wrong for that preference.
Yeah. So I just wanted to, in the interest of being fully comprehensive, I wanted to leave that door cracked for people so that they feel encouraged to experience their own experiences and actually utilize that information. I think whether it's training or nutrition or some of the psychological elements of interventions, it is important to lean on your own experiences and take them seriously.
I agree. And just to add two things. One, like to just reiterate something I said up top, but to make it very clear, a lot of this stuff is good advice in a vacuum, but becomes unhelpful advice if it leads to issues with implementation. But if you've tried, like if you've taken some of this advice on board, implemented it, and it didn't lead to issues with implementation and sticking with it long term, then it is great advice in a vacuum, and it's great advice for you. Like you said, it matches your experience, works well for you. The other thing I'll say is that with a lot of your experiences, like that you noted, some of the things you found for yourself that seem to comport better with some of this advice and seem to conflict a little bit with the literature. I wonder if it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario where the people for whom bodybuilding advice, like bodybuilding type nutrition advice, works well and matches well with their psychology, doesn't lead to issues with implementation and adherence. I wonder if those people are just the folks who are disproportionately likely to become bodybuilders in the first place.
I was thinking about that when I was like, well, I don't know. Some of this stuff has been really like because I have intentionally said, no, I'm going to be more compatible with the literature and take a more chill approach to my next diet. And I just can't get into it. So yeah, I do think that to some extent, bodybuilding is an innate, stable trait of a human being, rather than it is a hobby or pursuit. Like I do think that there are some of those traits that are fairly stable and persistent in me that nudge me towards certain approaches to dieting.
Yeah, I think sports as a whole select for different types of people. Like to be a power lifter, there's a certain level of psychosis you need to have to get very far in the sport, because I'm sure I'm going to make some people upset by saying this, but there are inherent risks and dangers associated with the sport that aren't inherent to all forms of general resistance training. Like catastrophic things can happen when you have 700 pounds on your back. They're unlikely to happen. They generally don't happen. But when you walk that weight out, like you feel it. You know that if something goes astray, my life could irrevocably change in this moment for the worse.
Well, yeah, and like an equipped bench presser.
Yeah.
Many of them are very familiar with what it feels like when your radius and ulna are bending.
Start flexing. Yeah.
That's an unusual thing.
Yeah, and so the sport selects for a type of person who isn't just comfortable with those things, but who likes those things, which is atypical. And so I think that bodybuilding is similar. Like I think it selects for people with like particular personality types and particular relationships with food, their own bodies, like satiety cues and signals, all of that stuff that probably in aggregate differs from population norms to a pretty large extent.
Yeah.
Which further, just on a fundamental level, calls into question the utility of, just normal folks trying to lose 10, 20, 30 pounds and keep it off, taking advice that bodybuilders have developed and found to be very effective for themselves and other bodybuilders.
Yeah, it definitely reinforces that point. And I think, your segment does a good job of saying, like, here is the bodybuilding toolkit.
Yeah.
And here is the not bodybuilding toolkit. And what I would, and I'm sure you would encourage people to do, is give yourself access to all the tools, right? So like a lot of the people who are really into this kind of bodybuilding oriented advice say, no, that other stuff doesn't work. That's not serious enough to work. And then people who embrace these other sets of approaches might say, oh, that bodybuilding stuff, way too rigid. It'll never work for anybody. The ideal scenario is grow your toolkit, figure out what's going to work for you, but don't feel like just because you're losing weight or you want to lose weight, that all of a sudden you're locked into the lifestyle of a bodybuilder in 1985 with a fanny pack and the white and black pants. They need to bring those pants back.
They need to bring, actually fanny packs are coming back.
Yeah, but I hear people are wearing them like around their shoulder.
Yeah.
That's not the same.
It's not a fanny pack anymore.
It's not.
Yeah.
All right, ready to move on?
Let's do it.
Cool. So my segment's going to be really short, really, really short. And the title here is, what is the healthiest diet? So I was getting into this a little bit because I was doing a piece for Mass about just kind of painting with broad strokes about nutrition. Like if you were just to give someone a really simple set of guidelines and say, you know what, this is going to broadly nudge you in the direction of a healthy eating pattern. Is this perfect? Have we fully solved human nutrition and optimized it for performance and longevity? Not quite. We're not there, but we have learned a couple things. And I think it's important to, when possible, lean on the things that we have some decent evidence for, right? So I was putting together this piece about like, what are some of those guidelines that can broadly set us in the right direction with our eating patterns? So that's one reason I wanted to talk about this. The other reason is, I don't think it's happening more or changing all that much, but I feel like in recent months, I've been so much more aware of the arguments on social media of just like the wars between all these different popular diets. And everyone's so focused on identifying the one and only optimal diet for the entirety of humanity that is perfect in all ways, not just in some ways, but actually my way of dieting is best for your brain, your performance, your body comp, your long-term health, longevity, cardiometabolic health, even the environment. All of the things are best with my diet. And when you see people making those same sets of claims for two diets that are literally mutually exclusive, you're like, what the hell is going on here, guys?
Yeah.
So it's harder than ever.
Let me note up top, as both your friend and business partner, I am both delighted and terrified by this recent development of you becoming aware of these things. Because I remember back when we met and you were in grad school and we would talk about just like fitness industry stuff. You had a pretty good knowledge of everything that had been going on before you went to grad school. And then things that had happened within the last like 4 or 5 years, very murky. You were a bit busy guy in the lab all the time, barely on social media, not really monitoring the chatter. And now you've been out of grad school enough and worked in a business that has to be on social media for things to function enough that over the last 2 or 3 years, you've started to become sucked into the vortex of just the dumbest and most ridiculous, but also most entertaining online arguments about inane shit related to health, nutrition, fitness. And I'm so excited for what the future holds as you continue to descend down those rabbit holes.
Yeah, I mean, so like for context here, my brain didn't fully come online, especially in the nutrition world, until like the late 2000s, which would have put me in my late teens, basically. I think that's right. Yeah. So, I mean, all the stuff that was going on in the 70s and 80s, perhaps it was as vitriolic and just flatly insane as it is today. I doubt it. But yeah, then so I was kind of tapped in the like late 2000s, early 2010s. Then I went to grad school, and everything happening in the outside world was just silenced. I was just kind of stuck in the lab, physically and mentally. And yeah, I've emerged, and I'm just like, what in the world's going on? And I will admit, I've been clicking on more things lately.
Yeah.
And so now all of the algorithm-focused social media sites are like, oh, you like really dumb claims about nutrition? Guess what? I have a million of them, and they're just flooding into my feed. So I do think, like I said, over the last couple months, but it's really been over the last few years, but over the last couple months, I've been clicking stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm really seeing the full weight of algorithmic social media and newsfeed stuff.
It's good stuff.
Yeah,
man.
my news feeds and timelines and all that stuff are just getting insane. Like, I'm losing touch with reality from some of the stuff I'm seeing. It's just a dazzling array of just insane claims and exaggerations and just flat out misinformation about nutrition. So anyway, like I feel like back in the day, it wasn't quite like this, where there was like some general agreement on, broadly speaking, what a decent diet looked like. Yeah. And then there were, they're of course quibbling over the details, and then maybe following some lines of research that eventually fell flat. For a minute there, everyone's like, oh, this margarine stuff seems pretty great. We can make these trans fatty acids. That seems like a good idea. And then eventually they're like, yeah, about the trans fatty acids, maybe not.
Yeah.
So anyway, these days things have gotten wild. And one of the things that really jumps out to me is that science is incremental, and it's slow. It's slow and it's incremental. Every now and then you'll have a paradigm shift that will really fundamentally change the trajectory of that boring, slow kind of incremental progress. But in the nutrition space right now, everyone is fully committed, it seems, to just imploding the paradigm. Like, I can't tell you the number of pitches for a fringe diet that they all start with, okay, first of all, forget everything you thought you knew about nutrition. And it's like, but I don't want to. I don't think it's a good idea for that to be the starting point for all nutritional discourse, is forget everything you believe you know.
Yeah, I mean, if you fully subscribe to the current scientific consensus, really on any topic, but like nutrition included, you will probably take on 5% incorrect beliefs, just because, science doesn't know everything yet. Things are provisional. And yeah, like the history of science suggests that we've been wrong about plenty of things before, and I'm sure we're wrong about plenty of things right now. But what percentage of our current scientific understanding of nutrition is wrong? I feel like it's a number less than 100%. So someone saying throw out everything, there are a lot of babies being tossed out with that bathwater.
Yeah, it kind of feels like if you were slowly and methodically over about 8 decades working your way toward the center of a maze, and then on a whim you just said, can you take me back to the start? I just want to start fresh and see what happens, right? And it's like, you can look at it from above and be like, dude, you were pretty close. Like, you were really getting there before you said, on a whim, I'll start over and try my luck with a different path.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's this knee-jerk reaction of just forget everything that people have, forget all the knowledge that has been obtained over the last 100 years, and let's just like go on vibes or, strained theories. And dude, I was telling you off air, I saw a thing, people look at these univariate correlations. It's okay, let's forget everything else in the world exists and only look at 2 variables, right? And, you'll see this all the time. You'll say, well, look at saturated fat intake has increased since the 80s, and look at this cardiometabolic or obesity rates, looks like they're both going up at the same time. Not good. Or, hey, look at sugar intake over the last 30 years and obesity rates. Looks like they're both going up. Dude, I saw one the other day that was looking at, again, with a univariate correlation like this, it's basically saying, okay, let's just assume everything else is equal. No other major confounders that we really have to worry about here. Pretty smooth sailing, but we'll just look at these two variables, some nutritional variable and obesity rates. The x-axis started in I think it started at the year 1700, and it was looking at sugar intake in the UK.
Love that.
And like you were saying off air, it's like, if you're going to look at a temporal correlation with obesity, just like any instance of industrialization is going to correlate with obesity over that time scale.
Yeah.
Like virtually anything. There's just so many insanely off track posts that you can run into. That's kind of why I wanted to do a little segment on so what if we didn't forget everything we know and instead just kind of made a short list of the things that we feel pretty good about knowing? Mm-hmm. So that's really the direction here. So, there's all these diets to pick from and people that will defend them to the death. High carb, high fat, carnivore, vegan, Mediterranean. The list goes on and on and on. There's these diets that people want to fight over. And always the question underlying those conversations is, what is the best diet? And I feel very strongly that is the wrong question to be asking. I would throw that question out entirely, and I would start from a different perspective. And that is, first of all, what are the major health issues that appear to be quite meaningfully impacted by dietary habits? What are the most pressing health issues that seem to be very closely linked to dietary habits and behaviors? And to me, some of the ones that really come up are obesity, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and cancer. Those are some of the things that come to mind for me. And so then the second question you ask yourself, instead of what is the best diet for all things, you kind of key in on those if we're focused on health, right? So we'll kind of put performance and stuff aside. So we've got this kind of cluster of, pathologies or characteristics or whatever, these things that seem to be correlated with negative cardiometabolic health outcomes or just generally, mortality rates and other health outcomes. We've got this set of things we're focused on. Instead of asking what is the best diet for all things, what kind of dietary patterns, not diets, seem to reduce or elevate risks for these independent outcomes, right? And so when we look at, for example, obesity rates, and we say, well, what kind of dietary factors or patterns seem to be important to consider here? You might look at a diet and say, okay, well, what kind of energy density are we talking about? In what way is this diet supporting satiety? Satiety and hunger regulation. How many hyperpalatable foods are finding their way into this diet? What we're looking at is dietary patterns that generally promote the overconsumption of total energy. So the term you'll see in the literature sometimes is overnutrition. Just what kind of things within a dietary pattern nudge us toward overconsumption. And a lot of times it does come back to those factors: energy density, satiety regulation, and hyperpalatability. With diabetes, that was one of the ones I mentioned. Of course, overnutrition or overconsumption of energy is certainly a factor. So we would lean on those previous factors I mentioned there, those previous broad dietary patterns. And other things that come up, though, with diabetes is we might specifically look at to what extent are we kind of acutely overloading the liver with excess energy substrates. Not acutely, like meal to meal, day to day, but are we having extended periods of time where we are coupling overnutrition with overconsumption of maybe some key nutrients that really promote the accretion of fat within the liver itself? Because I think a lot of people underappreciate the role that the liver plays when it comes to glucose homeostasis, but the liver influences many, many different pathways that are very critical in glycemic control. Yeah. And so if you're overfeeding and you have low physical activity, those two things alone are the key drivers, and I don't want to lose sight of that. But you might also take it a step further and say, well, aside from those two main drivers, we might also be a little bit wary about dietary patterns that promote really high intakes of specific nutrients that disproportionately facilitate fat accretion in the liver. And the two that come to mind would be saturated fat and fructose. That doesn't mean that you need to restrict both of those to the greatest extent possible, but what it means is, if we want to limit risk for type 2 diabetes, we want to avoid overnutrition and low physical activity. Those are by far the most important drivers, but we can also look at some individual, like if you're really going heavy on the saturated fat and the fructose, especially from added sugars in combination with overnutrition and low activity, those are the types of patterns that we might want to keep our eye on.
Yeah.
With hypertension, broadly, in many cases, we're going to be looking at sodium, potassium, and some key phytonutrients that can affect vascular and endothelial function. Heart disease, we might be looking at specific fatty acid intakes, added sugar intake, fiber intake. And then with cancer, we're looking, in many cases, at intake of fiber, certain phytonutrients that might decrease cancer risk. And then, of course, carcinogenic compounds that find their way directly into the diet, things that seem to have pretty direct links to the promotion of cancer formation. So, of course, these are hard to separate entirely, because a lot of these fall under the umbrella of metabolic syndrome. And so overnutrition and low activity is kind of broadly influencing essentially all of these outcomes. But we can start to look into little kind of individual nuances for each outcome. And again, kind of ask ourselves, not just the name of a diet that works here, but broadly speaking, what kind of dietary guidelines and patterns might we be nudged toward if we were really focusing on minimizing risk here? And this probably sounds like it's going to be like a 3-hour segment where we go a deep dive into each individual outcome. But instead, I want to lean on a couple sets of guidelines that I've been looking over lately that I think provide a pretty sensible starting point. Now, the huge caveat that's going to carry a lot of weight here. I'm going to go over these guidelines. There's 2 different tables that have a high degree of overlap. I'm not saying that any diet that deviates from one of these guidelines is a seriously and severely flawed diet. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm not saying that when we put these together, we have the perfect human diet. Frankly, I've given up on the idea of a singular perfect human diet. Humans are pretty flexible, pretty adaptable. That's why we're still here throughout all of the famines in our evolutionary history. We can adapt to a lot and live on a lot of different diets. So, sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, well, this isn't technically an essential nutrient, therefore you should never eat it. And if you do eat it, it's bad for you. That's silly. Humans, there are some essential nutrients we need, but to discredit a dietary pattern because it includes like carbohydrates that are not technically considered an essential nutrient, it's nonsense. It truly doesn't make any sense. So what I'm going to talk about here are some guidelines.
I do think it's funny that same logic. Like if that's what you're saying, like if something isn't necessary, you don't need to consume it at all. I've never seen someone apply that same logic to non-essential amino acids.
Yeah.
But like, why shouldn't it apply?
Yeah. No, it's a convenient way to discredit a dietary pattern that includes something that yours does not.
Yeah, it's the type of thing where if you throw it out to an audience that doesn't really have their guards up, it sounds really insightful and impressive until you think about it for 3 seconds.
Yeah.
And then hopefully you have continued talking enough that people won't think about it for 3 seconds because they're thinking about the next thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about here is a couple sets of dietary guidelines that, again, it's kind of a la carte, cafeteria style. When I'm putting together a dietary pattern and establishing eating behaviors and habits, what I want to try to do is check some of these boxes off. So this is not a concise list that leads you toward a particular named diet. This is just things that it would be nice if your diet checks a lot of these boxes, or we shouldn't really treat them as dichotomous either. So if, for example, you're supposed to get 400 grams a day of something, and it's like, okay, well, I usually get about 320. Well, that's better than 100, right? So it's about, these are some guidelines to shoot for. You want to get close to them if you can, and ideally get close to many of them, and check off as many of these boxes as you can. So table number 1 that I'm looking at here, I'll put it on the screen. These are the healthy diet indicator criteria from the World Health Organization. And I know some people, the World Health Organization isn't necessarily your direct pathway to make people say, okay, now I can let my guard down. I know a lot of people have said a lot of things about the WHO in recent years. Their Q rating, I guess, isn't as high as it used to be. A Q rating is like a term that they'll use in like various places. Like, how do people generally view you? Like your general good vibes to an audience.
Yeah.
So yeah, people have been really critical of the World Health Organization and in some very specific pockets of the population, I'd say.
Yeah, I would say for a combination of deserved and undeserved reasons, and I don't want to elaborate beyond that. Yeah,
so what I want to get at here is, regardless of the organization, you don't want to just say, well, I'm going to turn off critical thinking, and just because any particular organization says something, I'm not going to, I'm just going to blindly accept all of it. But in this case, it's a set of criteria that is extremely compatible with the best available evidence in nutrition. It's a really rigorous set of criteria that I think leads you toward a really nice eating pattern. And for the record, I currently have a high level of trust for the World Health Organization. I think they're doing their best and generally doing a decent job. But anyway, table 1 here. Fruits and vegetables, you want to be aiming for greater than or equal to 400 grams a day. Total fat, you want to limit that to no more than 30% of total energy. Saturated fat, no more than 10% of total energy. Polyunsaturated fats, aiming for 6 to 11% of total energy. Free sugar or like added sugars, less than 10% of total energy. Dietary fiber, at least 25 grams a day. And potassium, at least 3,500 milligrams per day. Now, people are going to look at that in a variety of different diet groups, people who are kind of really strong proponents of a particular diet. Mm-hmm. There's going to be some elements they love and some elements they hate. So, for example, if you're someone who's really, really adamant about ketogenic diets, you would look at total fat less than 30% of total energy. You're not going to like that. You're going to be pretty annoyed by that. But you might look at free, added sugar less than 10% of total energy and say, well, yeah, that makes sense. That's sensible. So it's important to recognize, I'm not saying that like no one can be healthy on a ketogenic diet, right? But this is kind of a list of just painting with broad strokes what general dietary patterns seem to be associated with really positive outcomes in terms of mortality and just broadly cardiometabolic health. Mm-hmm. So that's the first table. The second table, that was from 2015. That was the set of criteria. Looking at 2020, there's an updated set of criteria. I can't really tell based on the paper if this is necessarily like from the World Health Organization or if it's just a research group who said, we want to propose some 2020 updates to it. Mm-hmm. But in any case, I do think it adds a couple little boxes to it that are pretty sensible. So the scoring for these 3 things is just greater than 0 grams per day, mm-hmm. which just means, hey, try to eat this stuff.
Yeah,
it's generally associated with some nice things. Those categories are beans and other legumes, nuts and seeds, and whole grains. And broadly speaking, when you look at the observational literature and you combine it with randomized controlled trials, dietary patterns that feature these in relatively moderate to high amounts seem to do pretty well, right? So that's why the recommendation is greater than 0 grams. It's like, try to build a diet that includes some of these things. It recommends limiting dietary sodium to less than 2 grams a day, so less than 2,000 milligrams. It recommends 0 grams per day of processed meat, which qualitatively speaking just means probably don't eat processed meat. If you do, try to limit that to the extent you can. And then for unprocessed meat, it says less than or equal to 71 grams a day. Very oddly specific number. But what they're generally getting at there is, hey, there's other protein sources that are not I said unprocessed meat. It should be unprocessed red meat.
Yeah.
So that's actually a big flub that I made there. So they're referring specifically to unprocessed red meat with that limit of less than or equal to 71 grams per day. So again, broadly speaking, what they're doing is looking at the literature in aggregate in its totality and saying, okay, these seem like generally good boxes to check when you're putting together a relatively healthy eating pattern. And again, we don't want to approach this super dogmatically, right? So for example, with sodium, that's going to be one that gets people pretty riled up because right now there's a pretty big contingent, especially in the fitness space, saying like, you know what your biggest problem is? You're not having enough sodium and you need to have salt like before your workouts and stuff. And then there's another contingent that's kind of more from the conventional health literature saying, it seems like, in populations where there's really high sodium intake, hypertension seems to be a prevalent issue. And for a large percentage of those folks, reducing sodium and or increasing potassium seems to very much help with those hypertension outcomes. So with sodium, it gets complicated because there does seem to be some diversity in terms of genotype, where some people are more sensitive to salt than others when it comes to blood pressure and hypertension. So some people will increase their dietary sodium and it really doesn't affect their blood pressure much at all. Some people increase their dietary sodium and their blood pressure goes up and they might have higher risk for hypertension. And there are even some people who they almost have like an inverse relationship where if they are at their normal level and they drastically minimize their sodium intake, their blood pressure actually goes up, which is a bit odd. And so I don't think it's easy to do like a one size fits all recommendation for sodium. And then of course, I mean, you start talking about athletes who compete in or train and compete in hot weather, and they're losing a lot of sodium in their sweat, so their sodium needs are kind of influenced by that. So again, we're not putting these guidelines on a pedestal and being super dogmatic and saying you need to check every single box regardless of context. But, like I was getting at earlier, I think when it comes to putting together a healthy dietary pattern, we want to just kind of lean on what seems to be the consensus of the best available evidence. Like, what things do we have a pretty good handle on currently when we look at long-term cardiometabolic outcomes and mortality outcomes? And when we kind of put these two tables together, we start to get a really nice set of dietary criteria that we can broadly view as compatible with favorable health outcomes. To what extent you wish to adhere to any particular one of these is totally up to you. Like, I'm not here to get in an argument with someone who says, well, I like to eat way more than 30% of my calories from fat. That's totally fine. What I would say to that person, and a lot of people are in that position, ketogenic diet does have some very sensible applications. But what I would say is, okay, you want to have 70% of your calories coming from fat. That falls short of one of these boxes. But where's that fat coming from? Maybe then you say, okay, but I am limiting added sugar. I am eating plenty of, very fibrous, low starch vegetables so that I'm getting fiber in. I'm getting my vegetables every day. Through that, maybe I'm getting plenty of potassium. My fiber is adequate. What I would encourage people to do is not say there's one criterion on this list that I hate, therefore I'm throwing out everything.
Yeah.
The purpose of this, you might say, well, I don't really like beans and legumes. Fine. But you can still, adhere to or strive to meet some of these other quantitative objectives, and it will probably be fairly compatible with some nice health outcomes. So you don't have to buy the whole list or sell the whole list, but it is a set of criteria that broadly nudge people towards some pretty pretty health compatible eating patterns. So broadly speaking, what we're looking at here when you start to just condense it more qualitatively is plenty of fiber, which broadly speaking seems to be a really solid thing for a variety of health outcomes. What I would call a suitable intake of both potassium and sodium. And this is one of those things that if you're like, listen, I don't think I'm particularly sensitive to sodium in the diet. I don't want to worry that much about potassium and sodium, either their absolute amounts or their relative amounts compared to one another. For those folks, I'd say at bare minimum, just keep an eye on your blood pressure. If you start noticing that you're getting into the pre-hypertension or even hypertension range, of course, I'm not a doctor, so this isn't medical advice, but if I started to see my blood pressure going up, I'd go and chat with a doctor and say, what's going on here? And they might say, hey, why don't you try limiting sodium and see what happens? There might be a variety of different routes you can take there. So if you're someone who doesn't want to get really particular about potassium and sodium, I totally get that. I know a lot of natural bodybuilders who they're like, hey, I just noticed that I eat 7 grams of sodium per day. Is that bad? And that's kind of high, but I mean, their blood pressure's in a normal range. They're not having any adverse cardiometabolic indices that can really be observed, and they're keeping an eye on those things. And it's like, well, then I don't know, do what you want to do.
Yeah, that's kind of the boat I'm in. I'm at probably like 6-7 grams of sodium a day.
Yeah,
but like you're describing, the issue I have, if anything, is getting hypotensive.
Mm-hmm.
And even when I was up near 280, blood pressure was like 110/70, and it's lower now, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's really low.
Yeah. Sometimes stand up and get all woozy, but
yeah.
But yeah, so if I was if my blood pressure was like 140/90 or something, then I certainly would cut back.
Yeah, or at least, get with a doctor and say, what do you recommend as a first line of action here? And I expect they probably would say, let's look at probably sodium, if not both sodium and potassium, and just try to get those in a more comfortable balance based on what your blood pressure is telling you.
Yeah.
So yeah, the broad strokes here: high fiber, a suitable potassium to sodium intake. Usually blood pressure is going to help you kind of figure out if that needs to be acted upon. Plenty of fruits and vegetables. You want to minimize processed meats and charred meats. You don't eating charred meat that, there have been some studies saying, maybe not ideal for gastric cancers. Red meat in moderation. I'm certainly not saying that, people should eat zero red meat, but broadly speaking, when you look at the literature, it generally trends in the direction of saying maybe in moderation. The long-term health outcome literature, for example, for like fish and poultry, seems to be a little bit more favorable than it is for red meat, especially fatty cuts of red meat.
Mm-hmm.
You want to eat enough protein to support lean body mass, of course, which doesn't necessarily take all that much, as we've talked about previously. Maintaining a reasonably high ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fatty acids seems to do pretty well in the literature. I know a lot of people have essentially built their entire personality around fighting that recommendation. Like, if you were to go out and say, hey, like polyunsaturated fat's pretty good, saturated fat might want to limit, some people will just absolutely lose it when that comes up. But I mean, the literature isn't really that hard to parse with those outcomes. It looks pretty straightforward. Like, I wouldn't say like, yeah, I mean, there have been both observational lines of evidence and randomized controlled trials where managing that ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fatty acid, preferably nudging it toward the higher range, seems to be pretty good for blood lipids and cardiometabolic outcomes. Total fat intake, not too low, not too high. That's where a lot of the research generally nudges you toward. And then saturated fatty acids, capping those at less than 10% of total energy, broadly speaking, seems to be pretty compatible with the research. You have something to say?
I do. Just
Yeah.
one thing to point out that I find kind of funny. So you mentioned people who who just like really push back against the polyunsaturated to saturated fat stuff, and also just people in general who have fringe nutrition ideas that are very much not supported by the literature. Like one thing to note that I think most listeners are probably aware of is that a lot of the research in nutrition, specifically for long-term health outcomes, comes from either like observational epidemiological studies or like cohort studies. There aren't that many like 30, 40-year RCTs where you say, I don't know if there are any, but yeah, like it's not like there are a ton of studies where you say like, hey, we're gonna have one group eat low saturated fat, one group eat high saturated fat for the next 30 years and just observe the outcomes. And like they're definitely going to stick to that. Because yeah, like that's not how humans eat. Like people aren't going to want to sign up for a study where researchers are controlling their diet for the next 3 decades. So people with very heterodox nutritional ideas will point to the research that does exist and be like, ooh, you're making the classic blunder. You're drawing causal inferences from observational research, which that part in a vacuum is a fair critique. And then they'll take the next step and say, and in fact, these things that healthy people seem to do, it is actually bad for their health, but because people are telling them they're healthy, like they're doing these things, but also like a lot of other healthy behaviors. And so ultimately you're dealing with a case of healthy user bias, where it looks like the things I'm promoting are associated with bad health outcomes, looks like the things the World Health Organization, like the EU, similar body in the US, like it seems like all of the things they're promoting are associated with good health outcomes. But you know what? Turns out you can't believe any of that stuff because it's all just observational research, and actually you should just only live on a diet of raw red meat. Yeah. But the thing is, then they'll come back with claims of like, and guess what? Carbs, they'll kill you. All seed oils and things with high levels of omega-6s, they're poison. They'll kill you. Vegetables, guess what? They'll also kill you. But it's like, I have a hard time understanding how you square that with the critique of observational research and healthy user bias. Because the thing is, if those things are so bad, you still have to contend with the fact that the folks who eat that way still do have generally positive health outcomes. Like, right. There is an upward constraint on how bad and poisonous those things can be, you know? Like,
yeah, unless you're contending that, like, if those people were just eating the way I told them, they would live to maybe 150 years old.
Yeah.
You know, like, yeah, it is. So someone tried to, like, drag me into a debate, which is always the best way to do it. Just a online debate where two very confident people yell over each other and cannot fact check each other in real time. That's always the best. Someone was like, hey, you should debate this person. And I said, well, we have such severe gaps, such a mismatch in terms of the way we view epistemology, just what levels of evidence we find to be convincing and compelling. And like, we can't even agree on, like, broadly speaking, what is the hierarchy of evidence for nutrition and what counts as very credible nutrition evidence. And based on that, there would be no utility of doing a debate. And it's kind of like, hey, let's play this sport, but we absolutely will not agree upon the rules before the match. Yeah. We'll just go into it. You'll be playing one sport, I'll be playing a fully different version, and we'll just, like, kind of figure out how it went after the fact.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's so many instances where you'll see people saying, yeah, I mean, sure, there's all this evidence that shows that at bare minimum, all these things are really, really compatible with great health and you know, excellent long-term health outcomes. But I want to throw that out because have you seen this in vitro research? You know, or I eat very differently, and sure enough, I am right here and alive. So how do you explain that?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just this general rejection of, really high quality epidemiological research in nutrition. Rejection, well, the RCTs are too short. The epidemiological stuff is too observational. The cohort stuff, they didn't really control it that well, even though it was, a cohort-based intervention over several decades. So, let's just bring it back to the Petri dishes and just assume that I can learn more from a mouse with fundamentally different metabolic characteristics than I can from 20,000 humans who were involved in a prospective cohort intervention.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with that. So I'm certain that there are going to be a lot of folks that hear this segment and say, this Trexler guy's an idiot because has he seen this mouse study and ignored all the relevant human evidence? And yeah, there's some of these battles that just really can't be won in the short term. And it is what it is. But now that we've discussed some of these broad strokes, kind of basic eating patterns and kind of guidelines that seem to be most compatible with the current evidence, inevitably people are going to say, yeah, but give me a diet. Give me a named diet that works and is better than the rest. I don't want to do that, but I will say there are multiple named diets that generally check off plenty of these boxes, right? So a couple that come to mind, this isn't the whole list, but two that come to mind. I think the DASH diet tends to be a pretty sensible diet. I think if you don't have hypertension, there might be some constraints in there that are not fully applicable to you. So I'm not saying it's the perfect diet for all people, but the DASH diet tends to do pretty well. The Mediterranean diet tends to do pretty well. I know a lot of people then come in and argue very aggressively about what the Mediterranean diet truly is. I'm just going off of the intervention studies and the set of characteristics that have broadly been embraced in the literature to this point. So, for example, stuff you eat on the Mediterranean diet, plenty of whole grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, healthy fats, herbs, and spices. I read that quote from an image here before people just absolutely tear me apart for using the term healthy fats. But broadly speaking, they're talking about fats that have a lot of unsaturated fatty acids and relatively low saturated fatty acid content. The stuff that is, still pretty heavily emphasized, but not quite as much as the others. We've got fish, other seafood, and foods that are rich in omega-3 fatty acids. Poultry, eggs, and dairy, still part of the diet, but not quite as highly emphasized. And then things that you would eat sparingly would be things like red meats and, sweets with a lot of added sugar. When we look at the DASH diet, again, plenty of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, lowish fat dairy products, fish, poultry, beans, nuts, seeds, vegetable oil, stuff like that. Things that you would limit on a DASH diet or that kind of eating pattern would be fatty meats, full fat dairy, sugar sweetened beverages, sweets, and really high added sodium intake. People again are going to go nuts and say, well, here's this study on full fat dairy that says it's fine. I'm not saying that these eating patterns I'm not saying that every guideline in here is fully necessary for every single individual, but these are a couple dietary patterns that, broadly speaking, are pretty compatible with those broad guidelines from the two healthy diet indicator sets of criteria that I mentioned previously.
Yeah, just saying, if you're very insistent about having a named diet,
yeah,
these seem to be pretty good.
Yeah, they seem to be pretty good, but most importantly, the key point here is that these are not the only two options. There are plenty of cuisines around the world that are very much compatible with these broad sets of eating patterns and eating behaviors. So I know one thing a lot of people say is that some of these named diets often tend to be used in a way that kind of excludes major portions of the world. It just kind of recommends particular food items, and sometimes you'll see here's a sample meal pattern, and you'll find that it's very it's not very compatible with different cuisines around the world, and just, different, spices and food sources. They tend to get very regionalized and say, okay, everyone in the world, ignore your cultural traditions and eat just this set of foods, right? And that's not necessary. There's plenty of cuisines around the entire world that could be fully compatible with these types of eating patterns, with, just little modifications and little bits of effort here and there to incorporate certain food items. So, I'm not saying, everyone has to eat these two named diets. These are two that come to mind that are pretty well studied, that check a lot of the boxes. But I mean, I've been eating a lot of different, as I've kind of transitioned into a more plant-based eating pattern, I've been eating a lot more Asian cuisines. I've been eating a lot of Chinese food, Thai food, Vietnamese food, Indian food. And yeah, man, it's great. But it is kind of eye-opening. I used to eat essentially just shredded chicken for every meal, and like just eating like kind of the very generic sets of vegetables that come in the American supermarket. And to me, I'm like eating all these foods. I'm like, I've never heard of this in my life, but they still broadly allow you to check a lot of these boxes, Yeah. You seem to be very tickled, and I don't know why.
No, two things. One, just your mention of eating a broader variety of foods. One of my favorite Eric interactions of all time was one time when you came over to work and you just had this gleam in your eye. You said, "Greg, have you heard about cumin?" That was one of the better starts to a workday I've ever had.
I came in like I was like a music insider with my ear to the ground and was like, dude, something just dropped.
Yeah.
Like cumin is out. and have you heard of this? Did you know it was coming? Like, yeah. It'd be like if somebody dropped a new album and I was the first person that heard.
Yeah. So that was my first thought. The first thing I found a little amusing. Second thing, mentioning that you've been eating more Asian cuisine, more like Chinese food, more Indian food, etc. This is slightly tangential to health, not exactly what you're talking about, but since this is somewhat a segment about difficult to defend health claims that people make online, one of the ones that just at its most basic level I find quite humorous is people claiming that like vegetarian and vegan diets, and particularly diets high in soy and low in animal products, animal fats, are just like catastrophically bad for reproductive function. Because like, look. When
look at the scoreboard.
Yeah, exactly. If you just pull up a list of where are there a lot of people, where does it appear that people have been really successfully procreating, and what do they eat?
Yeah.
I think that that is observational evidence. If someone wants to throw that back at me, I'll take it on the chin. But like, come on.
But again,
the
claim that you're making is this eating pattern tanks fertility. Like,
right? Yeah.
It doesn't take that much observational research to at the very least nullify that claim.
Correct.
Like,
yeah.
If you're telling me this dietary pattern is incompatible with fertility, I don't have to clear a high bar to disprove that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So wrapping things up here, and the reason I bring up the different cuisines though is I know there's been a movement within the dietetics profession to just be a little bit more culturally inclusive, because what they kind of observed, like in American dietetics, is that everyone was coming in and a lot of this isn't a knock on dietitians because they identified that this was a practice that needed updating. But people were coming in from all different cultural backgrounds with all different cooking experiences and cuisines. And everyone was just being sent home with like, have you tried white potatoes, broccoli, and chicken breast? And they're like, I don't eat this shit.
Yeah.
Like, this is not, I've never known people that eat this. Like, this is not how I eat. Like, can you meet me not halfway. Can you meet me an eighth of the way in the middle here? And so like, it is important to kind of just acknowledge that very, very different cultural traditions and cuisines and things like that, they can all be incorporated in a way that meets some of these broad criteria.
Yeah.
People will, I can already see comments coming in. Thank God, as we've covered in previous episodes, I don't read them. But, but what about seed oils being catastrophic? That's an unsupported claim. It just is. What about gluten causing all sorts of problems for people who don't have celiac disease or sensitivity, if broadly speaking, to like high FODMAP foods? Again, it's an unsupported kind of line of inquiry that people have taken mostly to sell books. What about carbs being the root of all cardiometabolic problems? They're just not. It's not hard to disprove that in a pretty convincing way. Well, Eric, you don't talk about biohacking and fasts and things like that. There's a reason for that, because it's unsupported. We're just looking at the distilling from decades and decades of nutritional science. What are the things we feel like we can really hang our hat on here? What about plants being poisonous? Not going to entertain it. It's a silly idea. If you really want to make the claim that eating vegetables is a potently deleterious act, you have no value for research. And therefore, like, that conversation is a non-starter, because I'm going to lean on the research of actual health outcomes in humans. And if you really think that eating vegetables is a severe hazard to human health, I truly don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
And again, the idea that, for example, all animal-based protein being unhealthy, that also is an unsupported thing. And I'm saying that as a vegan, like I'm trying to play it just by the book here, looking at the literature. I don't currently eat any animal-based proteins, but I don't have to go around and say, whoa, actually, they're absolutely catastrophic to your health just to make myself feel better. Like I said, there is some evidence to say, it might be worthwhile to limit certainly processed meats, and then, maybe also like fatty red meat in moderation, right? But the literature pertaining to poultry and fish is excellent, and I don't have to justify my own biases by making untrue, unsupported health claims,
Yeah.
So, just be careful out there, folks. There's a lot of stuff in nutrition, a lot of different dietary kind of pockets out there of really, really enthusiastic proponents who want you, for some reason, to throw out decades and decades and decades of incremental scientific progress. And I would, at the bare minimum, just encourage you to resist that urge to, like I said, that example with the maze, maybe hesitate before saying, take me back to the start and I'll just try a totally different path and forget everything I learned along the way.
Yeah.
So, do we know everything with nutritional science? Of course not. We don't have enough. We don't have a fully complete picture. We cannot draw up this and say this is the optimal single human diet. Like I've said previously, I don't think that even exists. I think that's a bit of a fool's errand. But the stuff isn't that complicated to the extent that you should say, well, is it possible that we truly don't know a single thing about human nutrition? So people will try to overcomplicate and, misattribute blame to certain nutritional components. They're largely doing that to just open up a little space, kind of create a niche for whatever angle they're trying to take. But what I would encourage people to do is just focus on broad eating patterns. Try not to focus on demonizing individual nutrients or individual food sources. And when we look at the broad eating patterns that are compatible with, supporting health, longevity, etc., we are starting to work our way toward a nice, concise little list of patterns and behaviors that seem to be very compatible with a healthy diet.
Yeah. One thing I guess that I would add is I have nothing but disdain for most of the people who put forth and promote a lot of these pretty unjustifiable perspectives on nutrition. But I will say that I and I assume both of us have quite a bit of empathy and understanding for people who would get sucked in by a lot of that.
Yeah.
I think that there's, I think it makes sense to look around and say, especially in America, which is where around half of our audience is located. And I mean, a pretty disproportionate chunk of the most out there nutrition folks are American. And I think there's probably a reason for that. But I think it's easy to look around and say, well, there's science seems to have improved our lives in so many ways and like advanced so much. Like, people aren't dying from communicable diseases at nearly the rates they were a long time ago. Like a lot of medication has improved, like treatment of heart disease has gotten way, way better. Like that kills way fewer people than it used to. Cancer treatment seems to be improving. On the tech side of things, compare computers today to computers 30 years ago. Seems like there's so much progress being made. But it seems like in spite of a lot of external markers of progress, just the general health of a lot of people seems to be kind of trending down. Or, yeah, I mean, like you look around and there's a lot of very unhealthy people out there. And it doesn't seem to comport particularly well with the advances we've seen in other things. And I think it's easy to look at that and then look at, some of the worst excesses of the industrialization of food production, all of like the hyper palatable, hyper processed foods on the shelves, and just kind of find yourself in a position where it feels like something is just wrong with food. Like there has to be something amiss for us to find ourselves in the position we're in. Given the broader progress we're seeing in basically all other domains. So like what's going on there? And so I think that I think that a lot of that is like very multifactorial. But I think that like single factor thinking is very seductive because it can give you a sense of control, and it can give you a feeling that, hey, if I can just like control and manage this one thing, like I can take control of my life, get everything back on track. Like it's a easier narrative than trying to look at like all of the different underlying causes of things going on. And the solution also presents itself as being easier than, like, hey, let's completely redesign American cities so that you can walk and cycle more and be more active and, maybe be a little healthier for that reason. Like, let's try to transition away from fossil fuels so air quality is better. So if you have asthma, you can go outside without hacking up a lung. Like, like like big structural problems are more challenging to tackle. And I think that by and large, like the American political system has proven itself to have little appetite for tackling a lot of those things. And so, I don't know, like all of it can just make you feel like you're going crazy and just losing control of your life. And when you find yourself in a situation like that, a silver bullet type solution that at least like purports to have really vast and powerful explanatory power starts being very appealing and seductive. And so like I absolutely understand how consumers of that information kind of get sucked down those rabbit holes and find it convincing or at least alluring, enticing. Yeah. So I have a ton of empathy for folks who find themselves in those content spaces, but Yeah, I just encourage you to, I don't know, just take a step back and look at things a little bit more critically.
Yeah, I know. I totally echo that. I think it's very understandable to be in a position where you're ready to embrace some of those ideas. And I think it's really easy nowadays to be exposed to those ideas in a way that's very, very convincing and compelling, which I understand, but also just generally view to be unfortunate, you know? But yeah, I certainly don't fault anyone for getting drawn into some of those narratives. And like one of the things that always comes up along those lines, like you're kind of getting at this with what you're saying, but like I've seen so many people on the internet who it's like they have embraced a pretty compelling sales pitch for some very heterodox, like very fringe nutrition idea. And their response to it is, you know, if you say, well, like, look at these guidelines that are pretty broadly embraced by like every major health focused organization across the world. It's not like one government is just kind of setting the rules here. You know, if you bring up that kind of argument, a lot of times it'll be like, oh yeah, great. That goes into the dietary guidelines, and look how far they've gotten us. Like the U.S. government dietary guidelines.
Yes.
And to that, I will often say, who do you know who doesn't? I'm not talking about adherence. Who do you know who can currently state the government dietary guidelines? Almost no one in the general population even knows what they are, aside from just general vibes, which is vegetables are nice, and don't eat as many desserts. Like that's pretty much the extent to which the general population knows the U.S. dietary guidelines. And then ask yourself, of the people who know them, who applies them, right? And so like the idea that you can say, well, here's the guidelines, here's the population level outcomes. Looks like the guidelines aren't working. I mean, that doesn't, it kind of implies or assumes that people are actually following those guidelines, and all of the empirical evidence would tell us that they're not.
Correct.
You know, so that feeds into a lot of that conspiratorial thinking of like, you had your chance to set the guidelines and look how far it's gotten us. Well, the act of setting a nutritional guideline is not really the helpful part. It's the adherence to a set of dietary habits and behaviors. And you can make the argument that perhaps maybe there would be some utility in reframing these various eating patterns in a way that would make adherence more likely. I think that's a very strong case you could make. But the idea that because obesity rates are high, or, you know, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, whatever outcome you want to focus on, because those are high, necessarily the guidelines are flawed, that if you just interrogate that argument in and of itself, it doesn't hold up. It fully breaks down. So yeah, I echo your sentiment. Like I think it's unfortunate that folks are making these very superficial arguments that draw people in. I think it's unfortunate that some of those arguments on the surface level do seem to be quite compelling. And ultimately, I have a lot of empathy for people who are being led down a road that is ultimately somewhat deleterious to their health, and without really knowing it or signing up for that, you know?
Yeah.
And then one other thing I just want to reiterate, there's going to be folks who are like, hey, my dietary pattern that I prefer doesn't really mix well with all of these criteria. That's completely fine. Like I have no interest at all in trying to dictate how people eat. I just try to put out information that seems most compatible with the evidence. Like there's going to be people who are really healthy who say, Eric, I'm on a ketogenic diet and I'm, you know, deviating from several of these items, but I love the way I eat and all of my metrics right now would indicate that I'm in good health. If you expect me to be upset about that, you fundamentally misunderstand my incentives. I don't want people to be in poor health. So if you're in great health and not adhering to all these guidelines, I am genuinely happy for you. But the purpose of guidelines is to say, okay, if we put 30 million people on a diet and we had to kind of give them some boxes that they should strive toward checking, these are the broad brush strokes, you know, the general guidelines that they ought to be aiming for based on the evidence. That does not preclude in any way the possibility that there are people who deviate from these regularly and are experiencing really good health at the moment. So that's not the intention. I know a lot of smart folks who are on, ketogenic diets that don't check all of these boxes, but are still really well formulated diets. I think a lot of people assume that if you're on a ketogenic diet, you basically just eat like Philly cheese sandwiches without the bread all day, and that's like all you eat, right? Just beef and cheese, and that's it. I know a lot of folks who are, on ketogenic diets. They eat a lot of fibrous vegetables. They have some nuts and seeds in the mix. Like, they actually do check more of these boxes than you might think. So I don't want this to be the type of thing that becomes like a diet wars. Like, I don't want to put gasoline on that flame and fuel more of it. But what I would encourage people to do is, if you have a dietary pattern that you really like, but perhaps you are unsatisfied with your current health status, or you have some concerns about, your current diet's compatibility with some of these guidelines, you don't necessarily have to overhaul every behavior in your life and immediately start from scratch. You might just consider saying, okay, I'm going to work toward getting a couple of these additional guidelines met within the broad eating pattern that I currently have. Okay, so the purpose here is to be helpful and to lead people toward evidence-based guidelines, not to disparage any particular dietary strategy or to make people angry because their preferred method of dieting doesn't, check every box. All right, so I think that does it for this episode. We went a lot longer than normal, but that's okay. No big deal. How far are we here?
About 2 hours, 40 minutes.
Whew. Yeah, that's more than I expected. That's okay though.
That's fine. That's what the audience likes. We're the only two people in this entire equation who actually want the episodes to be shorter.
Yeah, that's true. So hey, there you go. You're welcome, everybody. So hopefully people get some helpful stuff out of this. This is one of those episodes that isn't like walking through like 30 individual studies, but is more just pretty applied, I would say. Pretty applied. So hopefully this has been helpful. As always, we sincerely appreciate everyone for checking this episode out. And we will be back in about a week with another episode. Thank you for listening to the Stronger by Science podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to sign up for our free newsletter to get concise breakdowns of relevant research, as well as 28 free training programs for all skill levels and all schedules. We hate spam just as much as you do, so we'll only email you when we have something really interesting to share with you. You can sign up for the free newsletter at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter, or just go to the Stronger by Science homepage and click the free programs button at the top. If you want to join in on the Stronger by Science podcast conversation, be sure to check out our Facebook group and our subreddit. The links for both are provided in the description of today's episode. Finally, please remember that we are not medical doctors or registered dietitians. So, before you make any changes to your exercise or nutrition habits, be sure to check with a qualified healthcare professional. Once again, thank you for listening, and we will be back soon with another episode of the Stronger by Science podcast.